Chapter 27 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 27 The Home of the Barnes. Peggy stood in the shabby little room, miserable, ashamed, yet angry and defiant. It was now past 10 in the morning, and Barnes had gone to his work. The breakfast things had not yet been cleared away, and the room looked even worse than usual. When she saw her father and mother, she instinctively rushed to the door to let them in, but when they stood within the room, and she realized the sordid squalor of her surroundings, a flush of angry shame swept over her. For a moment the tears rushed to her eyes, and a sob caught in her throat, but she quickly mastered herself. She remembered what she had said to her father the day before she left her home. She caught herself thinking of their last interview, when they had come to the rooms to which Barnes had first brought her. Her old pride surged back in her. Her old sense of defiance dominated her. Poor as she was, miserable as she might be, squalid as were her surroundings, she would not let her father see any weakness in her. She would hold by the bargain she had made. She would not admit that she had made a mistake. Barnes had not told her where he had been on the previous night. When he had returned, very late, he had not spoken to her, and that morning he had been sullen and out of temper. He had given dark hints as to what would happen if something did not turn up, but he made no direct statement as to what had taken place. She was, therefore, ignorant as to how her father and mother had learnt her whereabouts, and knew nothing of Barnes's visit. "I could not help coming to you, my little girl," said the General. "You are in trouble, aren't you?" She did not reply, but looked at him silently, defiantly. "Now tell us all about it," went on her father. "Let us hear about your difficulties." "What difficulties?" "The difficulties the man you married, told me about last night." "Told you last night? What do you mean?" "Didn't you know he came to Hampstead?" There was a quick flash in the girl's eyes. Instinctively she understood what had taken place, that Barnes had been to her father to appeal for help, and she felt more humiliated than ever. "My darling, I'm so sorry. Tell us all about it," cried Mrs. Trelawney. "There's nothing to tell," replied the girl. "I'm not complaining." But, pleaded Mrs. Trelawney. "Surely, Peg, my darling, you'll tell your old mother." "I'm sorry he went to you," said the girl doggedly. "I knew nothing about it. He had no right to bother you." "But, my dear, we can't know of your trouble and not come to you." "I don't see why not. I took my own course. I forfeited all claims upon you when I left home. I must bear my own burden." The girl's spirit was unbroken. A proud look still flashed from her eyes. She might suffer, but she would suffer in silence, as far as they were concerned. Never would she willingly admit that she had made a mistake. "But he told us that you were in debt, almost starving." "He told you that, did he?" "That's why we came," said the General. "You are still our little Kitty, Peggy." Again the tears rushed into her eyes. The touch of tenderness well nigh broke her down, but again she steeled herself and became defiant. "I ask for no pity," she said. "Won't you come back with us and spend the day at home?" pleaded her mother. "We will bring you back here in time for your husband's dinner." "You'll not let him come home, then?" The question flashed from her with the suddenness of a pistol shot. They were both silent. They had made up their minds on this question. "I see. He's not good enough for you. I may come home, but not he." Still they remained silent, but they stood looking at her, and she could not help seeing the love that shone from their eyes. The girl understood. She saw what was in her father's mind as plainly as if he had spoken. She knew that he regarded Barnes as a vulgar outsider, a man with whom he would not willingly associate, one who was low-bred and contemptible, and she knew they were right, but she would not give in. Something within her rose in defiance of her father's feeling. She saw Barnes almost as they saw him, but something, she could not tell what, made her loyal to him. She would tell them nothing of his brutality, of his meanness, of the things he had said to her. "If he is not good enough to come to your house, I am not good enough." For a moment the General was nonplussed. He could not help admiring her loyalty to the man whose unworthiness he was sure she realized. He was a man of quick understanding, and he knew the kind of things he would say to her, knew of the reproaches with which he would taunt her. But she would not admit them to him. "But Peggy, my darling, we want to help you," cried the mother. "I don't want your help." "But he told your father that you would be thrown into the streets if something was not done." "Then I'll be thrown into the streets." "But we want you, Peggy," and there was a tremor in General Trelawney's voice. "Do you know Trev's home? And he's engaged?" The girl became interested in a moment. "Trev home? Engaged? To whom?" "To the sweetest girl I ever met," cried the General. "He met her in Ireland. Her name's Mary Penryn. She and her people were at our house last night. We all fell in love with her right away. And Trev is such a changed fellow. You never saw such a difference in a boy. The Penryns are a Cornish family. They have a place. It is little more than a farm, just outside Falmouth, and they're awfully nice people." "And she, what's she like? Is she good looking?" "Perhaps some might not call her so," replied her father, "but she's such a sweet, unselfish, good girl." The words made her realize where she was, what she had done, and again the look of defiance came back. She wanted to see Trev's fiancée more than words could say, for blood was thicker than water, and in her own way she had always been fond of Trev, but her father's words were a reproach. "Sweet, unselfish, good," she sneered. "I suppose she's one of the pious sort." "Yes," replied the General quietly. "She is. She says nothing about it, but she is. If Trev had searched the world over, he could not have found anyone who would have pleased me more." The girl did not speak a word, but looked out of the window on the dirty, dismal street with unseeing eyes. "If you'll come home," said the mother, "I'm sure Trev will go and bring her to meet you. He doesn't need any excuse to be with her, I can tell you," and she laughed as she spoke. "No," replied Peg, "I don't want to see her. Of course you've told her all about me, and I don't want to be introduced to my new sister as the bad girl of the family. For that matter, I'm not the bad girl of the family. I've only done what I felt it my right to do. Have you seen Eleanor lately?" "No," replied Mrs. Trelawney with a sigh. "We have not." "Is there any use your waiting here longer?" asked Peggy after an awkward silence. "This kind of thing doesn't make me any happier, and I don't suppose it's very pleasant for you. I'm not penitent a bit. I'm just the same as ever I was. I'm not going home to be pitied by the servants and patronized. Besides, I have my duty to my husband." She said this as a kind of afterthought, and she flung the words at her father almost insolently. "Very well, Peg," said the General. "Then there's no more to be said, except this. We want to help you if we can." "I refuse your help. I won't accept anything. If you won't recognize Jim, I don't want your help." "Do you think I can recognize him?" asked the General quietly. "Would you, Peg, like me to have him in my house and introduce him as the husband you have chosen?" Perhaps there was something more in her father's tones than in his words that helped the girl to see what his feelings were, and although she wanted to answer in the affirmative, she could not. Something kept back the words. "Yet we want to help you, my little girl," went on the General tenderly. "And I don't want to be helped." "Then we may as well go, Alice. Good morning, my dear. Please remember that your parents' house is always open to you." In spite of himself, he could not help the emphasis which, almost unconsciously, he laid on the last word. Peggy watched them go, saw them get into the motor car which stood near the door, and drive away. Then she stood for a long time motionless, her mind far away. She was thinking about 1,000 things she could not put into words. Presently she realized that there was a packet on the table, and almost listlessly she looked at it. It was a long envelope, and in her father's handwriting she saw the words, "For Peggy." Eagerly she opened it. At that moment she forgot all her pride and her stubbornness, forgot, too, that sense of defiance which she was glad she had maintained. The envelope contained the letter from the landlord of the house, telling them that if the rent was not paid they would be forthwith ejected. It also contained the bills which Barnes had shown her the night before. These Barnes had left at the General's house. She saw at a glance that the bills were receipted and that the account for the rent was settled. Then she caught sight of another envelope on which was written the words, "With Dad's and Mother's love." It contained several pound notes. In spite of herself her lips quivered, and again her eyes became flooded with tears. She stood for some time holding the notes in her hand, as if undecided what to do with them. Pride, defiance, tenderness, hunger were all expressed in her eyes. Her father had helped her in spite of herself. The rent was paid, the bills were settled, and he had left her money. She saw the meaning of it. Her father still loved her, and although in helping her he was obliged to help Barnes, he would help him as little as possible. He would not recognize their marriage, but his heart went out to her. Then the floodgates of her misery were opened, and throwing herself upon the shabby, greasy lodging-house chair, she burst into heart-breaking sobs. Barnes did not come home to lunch that day, but at 6:30 in the evening he appeared with a look half of fear, half of expectation in his eyes. For in spite of the mountebank bravado which he exhibited before her, the man was afraid of her. She did not speak on his arrival, but laid his evening meal before him without a word. "Nice loving welcome, anyhow," said Barnes presently. "Aren't you going to have any dinner?" "I'm not hungry." "What's the matter?" he snarled. "That's your pride, I suppose?" And there was a sneer in her voice. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean. You went to my father last night and told him about the rent and the bills that had not been paid." "Has he been here?" asked Barnes eagerly. "What did he say?" She took the receipted accounts from the envelope and flung them before him. "There," she said, and there was infinite scorn in her voice. Barnes looked at them eagerly and noted that the bills were receipted. "That's something, anyhow," he muttered in tones of satisfaction. "But is that all, Peg? Didn't he give you anything else? Tell me all about it. What did he say?" "He said enough to make me ashamed." "Oh, what's the use of talking like that? We can't live on air. But surely this is not all. He gave you some money, didn't he?" "I told him I would not have any," replied Peg. "I didn't know he'd paid these things until he'd gone. I never felt so humiliated in my life." "Do you mean to say he offered you money and you wouldn't take it? Why, you bloomin' idiot, can't you see that—" He caught his wife's eyes as he spoke, and in spite of his anger, The sentence hung on his lips unfinished. "After all, what's this?" he went on presently. "The next week's rent will be due on Saturday, and then what are we going to do? If, instead of paying these things, he'd given you the money, it would have been something like. I could have held a part of these bills over for a few weeks, and we should have had something to go on with." "You mean that you would not have paid your debts?" "You can bet your shoes I wouldn't have paid them until I was obliged. But did he come alone?" "No, my mother came with him." "And you didn't ask them for any money?" "Certainly not." "Well, of all the blithering fools! Why, you might easily have got a £20 note out of them, but for your infernal pride. Did they say anything about your going home?" "Yes. What?" "They wanted to take me back with them." "And you wouldn't go?" "No." "Well, of all the—" Barnes's indignation and wonder seemed to be so great that he could not finish the sentence. "Why didn't you go?" "Because I didn't want to." "Did they say anything about me?" "Not much." "But they said something. What was it?" "They said they would have me, but they would not have you." "And what was your reply?" "I told them that if you were not good enough to be received, then I wasn't." Barnes was silent a few seconds. Even he understood something of what was in the girl's mind. "Do you think they will ever relent, Peg?" he asked presently. "No, they never will." "A nice Christian he is," sneered Barnes. "A nice forgiving Christian gentleman, isn't he? He'll not have his own son-in-law in his house. Dirty pride. He's no gentleman, Peg. He may be a general and all that kind of thing, but he's no gentleman, my girl." The girl's anger was aroused in spite of herself. "Of course you would say that," she remarked. "Why shouldn't I say it? It's true, isn't it?" "No, it's not true." "Then what do you mean by talking like that?" "Because you don't know what a gentleman is." She was angry with herself as she spoke. She felt that she was becoming more and more common the longer she lived with this man, felt that she was sinking to his level, and yet she could not help herself. "Look here, none of that!" cried Barnes, starting to his feet. "I'm not going to be insulted." "Very well, then, you shouldn't ask me questions. Yes, hit me if you like, but you dare not. You're afraid." He flung himself into his chair again and went on with his dinner. "Did they tell you that your brother Trev was home?" "Yes." "He's on leave, I suppose?" "Yes, he brought home his fiancée." "Oh, I see. Some swell dame, I suppose. Of course she could come home, but I'm not good enough. Who is she?" "Her name is Penryn. She comes of an old Cornish family." "Old Cornish family, eh? No wonder the country is turning Bolshevist. I shall turn Bolshevik myself soon. It would do me good to see some of these proud-stomached aristocrats thrown into the streets." Peg did not reply. For some time after this there was a silence. Barnes was evidently thinking deeply. "I'm going out," he said at length. The girl did not speak. "You don't ask me where I'm going, but I'll tell you. I'm going to get a little pleasure, a little comfort. Fat lot of comfort I get in my own home with a wife who won't be reasonable." Still Peggy kept silence. "Have you nothing to say?" "I was only wondering where I should go when you had gone." "Oh, you can go where you like. I don't care." A feeling of helplessness and hopelessness rushed over her, and in spite of all she could do, she burst into a flood of sobbing. "What's the use of that?" asked Barnes. "If you were reasonable, we might get on, even yet." "Reasonable? What do you mean?" Well, we're in a hole. While rents are as they are, we can't live in this way. There must be a change. If we are to stay together, there are only two courses open to us." "Yes, what are they?" "One is that you'll get your old man to help us." "Oh, Jim," she cried, "I can't. I simply can't. Think of the way I left them. Think of the promises you made me, and then ask yourself how I can go back to them and no, I can't do it. I really can't. I'll do anything in reason. Let's get out of London. Let's go into the country somewhere and take a little cottage. I'll work like a slave. I'll do anything. But don't ask me to accept charity in that way." "Catch me leaving London!" cried Barnes. "Catch Jim Barnes getting away from everything that makes life worth living. Besides, you talk like a fool. How can I get anything to do in the country?" "What is the other thing you have in your mind?" asked the girl. "Why, if you'd consent to go to Camden Town and live with mother, we could save practically all our rent. That would make £2 a week difference to us. We could just manage then." But could we have our own rooms? Need we live with the family?" "I dare say that could be managed," replied Barnes quickly. He saw signs of yielding in Peggy's face, and was pleased accordingly. "But you must put on no airs, you know, and you'll have to help mother with the work." "I don't mind work. I don't mind anything," cried the girl, "but I do want to maintain my self-respect." "Well, there's some sense in that," said Barnes, somewhat mollified, "and I'll go up and talk with mother right away. But you are an awful fool, Peg. Your father could give you £3 or £4 a week without knowing it was gone, and we could be as happy as turtle doves." A week later, Peg found herself installed at 15 Primrose Terrace, Camden Town. It had cost her a good deal to consent, but consented she had, and for a few days after she had taken up her abode there she felt happier. She did her best to be agreeable to Barnes's two sisters, Edith and Emily, while even Mrs. Barnes was mollified at her evident endeavour to be pleasant. "Yes," said Mrs. Barnes to a neighbour to whom she had given a glowing account of Peggy's advent, "my son has brought his wife home, and as you may say, Mrs. Simpkins, she has brought a new interest to my life. She is a dear little thing, and of course a perfect lady." "I hear her father is a general," said Mrs. Simpkins. "Yes," said Mrs. Barnes, "and will soon be made a baronet or perhaps a lord. Of course it's a very high family. Oh, it was a perfect love match, Mrs. Simpkins." "Well, I hope it will turn out all right," remarked Mrs. Simpkins with a sniff. "I hope so, I'm sure," replied Mrs. Barnes. "And of course she fair worships the ground Jim stands on." "Well, I don't think much of these fine matches. After all, she can't be much of a wife to him. I'll warrant she's never done a day's work in her life, and doesn't know how to cook a dinner." "Of course no lady would," was Mrs. Barnes' reply. "Then what good is she as a wife? What's the use of marrying into a high family if you get no benefit from it? Now, if the General was to allow her, say, £4 a week, there'd be something in it. But there, I suppose he was not agreeable to the match." "My dear Mrs. Simpkins, it's all the other way. He was delighted with our Jim." "Then why didn't they go to Hampstead to live?" asked Mrs. Simpkins. "You say the General lives in a big house. Why shouldn't they lodge there instead of with you?" "Oh, my dear," and Mrs. Barnes gave a knowing smile, "you don't know our Jim. He's a regular Barnes, he is, proud as Lucifer. 'Jim,' says the General to him, 'you come and live with me. My house is open to you.' But Jim wouldn't. 'No, General,' he says, 'I've got me pride, I have, and I'll not accept charity from any one.' That's why he wouldn't take an allowance. But of course Emily and Edith will go up to 'Ampstead sometimes, and very likely Lady Trelawney will come to see me." "I shall believe that when I see it," sniffed Mrs. Simpkins. "What, you don't believe me?" cried Mrs. Barnes indignantly. "Didn't you see the General and his son come here the very day they was married? Oh, yes, I know it was a runaway marriage, and no doubt the Trelawneys were a bit angry at the time, but that was before they knew my Jim. What the General said to me that morning was this: 'What's done can't be undone, Mrs. Barnes, and I hope the two families will be friendly,' he says. You'll see, Mrs. Simpkins, you'll see." In spite of this and similar conversations, however, Mrs. Barnes was greatly chagrined at Peggy's insistent refusals to appeal to her parents for help. "What I say is this," she said to her one night. "If you love Jim as you ought to, you'll do everything you can for him. That's what I say. What's the use of having silly pride like that? It isn't as though your parents couldn't afford it." "Jim told me before we were married that he had no need of my father's help," was her reply. "Oh, that's all my eye. Young people talk like that without thinking. And I'll tell you this, Jim won't stand it forever, you know. I'll admit you're not a bad-looking girl, but good looks don't last long, and you're not as pretty as you were when Jim knew you first." Peggy realized this with a sense of bitterness, realized, too, that her clothes were becoming shabby, and that she saw no means of buying new ones. "Of course," went on Mrs. Barnes, "we were all pleased when Jim told us about you at first, but we naturally thought that your father, when he came home, would be sensible. It isn't as though Jim were a common young man. He might have married well, he might. And when he threw up Agnes Parks for you, I gave him a piece of my mind." "Gave up Agnes Parks for me? What do you mean?" "Oh, didn't you know?" and Mrs. Barnes laughed meaningly. "Did you think you were the first girl that Jim ever kissed? Why, he's had dozens of them, my dear. And Agnes Parks was a good chance, too. She has a nice little millinery business of her own, and makes good money. What I says is it's very hard for a young man to give up a girl with money, and to marry somebody who hasn't got a penny, and who is too proud to get it." "I'm not too proud," replied Peggy. "I have tried to get work." Mrs. Barnes laughed sneeringly. "Tried to get work? Yes, but what good are you? It's all very well to say you went to munitions and made good money before the war was over. That's no good now, you know. You're not fit for nothing, and that's why I say Jim was a fool to marry you. If you'd any sense, it would be a different thing. Besides, why hasn't your mother come to see you like any decent mother ought?" "Because I've not told them where I am," replied Peggy, "and because I would not have her here." "And why not?" asked Mrs. Barnes indignantly. "We're married into each other's families, and there ought to be a friendship between us. If she was anything like a lady, she'd invite me and the girls to come and see her, and the General would drop in here of a night and smoke a pipe. That's what I should like to see. I told him so straight. I said to him, 'General,' I said, 'you ought to set them up in a nice little home,' I said, 'and give them £1,000 as a nest egg, and then let there be friendship between the two families.' That's what I said to him straight. Now then, run away and lay the dinner table. I'm not going to do the work of the house while you sit here doing nothing." What this kind of thing cost Peggy can be better understood than described. Ever since the first day she came to the house, Mrs. Barnes had insisted on her doing the work of a servant. This the girl had done eagerly, almost gladly. Anything was better than sitting brooding over the past and wondering what the future would bring forth. Much as she hated her associations with Mrs. Barnes, this was not the heaviest burden she had to bear. It was when Barnes's two sisters came home at night, and she had to listen to their taunts, that her life became almost unbearable. For, although the first few days they treated her almost with kindness, their attitude presently changed. The girl could not help being proud and somewhat reserved, and the Misses Barnes instinctively felt that Peggy regarded them as her inferiors. It was this that antagonized them. "Of course," they said to her, "you stay here all day and do nothing while we earn our living. We've not got any aristocratic friends, but let me tell you this, madam, the name of Barnes is just as good as that of Trelawney, and if either of us married we wouldn't be a drag on our husbands. And you need not sniff at the young men we bring home, either. They were Jim's friends before you knew him, and are quite as good as you are." As for Barnes, he did not spend many of his evenings at home. In the main he went out alone, leaving his young wife to do the best she could. "Aren't you ever going to spend an evening at home, Jim?" she said to him one night. "I'll go with you to the movies if you like." "Oh, you've come to that, have you?" laughed Barnes. "Time was when you declared you would not go to such commonplaces." "I'll go anywhere for a little change," was her reply. "We might go to the movies, and even to the theatres, if you'd be sensible," he retorted. "But where am I to get money from for amusements? No, madam, when your dirty pride has come down a bit, and when your father comes off his high horse, I may be able to give you some pleasure, but not till then. As for me, I'm going to get comfort where I can." After she had been at Camden Town a few weeks, she wrote to her sister, begging her to come and see her. She was utterly miserable and depressed, and longed for society other than that of the Barnes family. She had not heard from Eleanor for a long time, and she had not the heart to go and see her, but now she could bear it no longer, and although the Barnes girls had hinted to her that her sister was obliged to leave St. Hildebrand's Mansions, she wrote to her there, and was more than delighted when she got a letter saying that her sister would come to her on the following Sunday afternoon. "May Eleanor come to see us?" cried Barnes when she informed him of her letter. "Of course she may. Mayn't she, mother?" "I suppose so," was Mrs. Barnes' reply. "But she must take us as we are. However, I expect that will be all right, seeing as how she works for her living, the same as other people, and I've never been the one to keep up ill feeling between the two families." During the next 2 days, Mrs. Barnes was more than ordinarily gracious to Peggy, and even went so far as to make special purchases at a local confectioner's in honour of Eleanor's coming. Winter was now upon them, and the days were cold and drear, and if there was one spot more depressing than another in the whole of Camden Town, it was Primrose Terrace. A cold grey mist wrapped the whole neighbourhood like a mantle, and Mrs. Barnes complained that the gas Peggy used in her room would drive her to the poorhouse. On the Sunday afternoon when Eleanor was expected, Peggy sat in her bedroom alone. She had drawn the chair to the window, and was watching every passer-by with eagerness. The thought of her sister coming to see her was like a ray of sunshine on a dark day. Never had she realized how dear her own flesh and blood were to her. At length she saw her coming down the street, and then, with an eagerness of which she did not believe herself capable, she rushed downstairs and ran towards the door. "Oh, Eleanor!" she cried. "I am glad you've come. This way, quick! Let us get upstairs before they see us." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 28. Eleanor visits Peggy. When they reached Peggy's bedroom, the two sisters looked at each other for some time without speaking. It seemed as though a barrier stood between them, a barrier that both were afraid to pull down. I hope you're not cold," said Peggy presently. "There's a fire downstairs, but I wanted to have you a few minutes to myself." "I don't mind the cold," replied Eleanor. "Is anything the matter, Peggy? Why have you come here to live?" "I'll tell you all about that presently," replied the girl. "But I want to know about you. These Barnes girls have been saying all sorts of horrible things about you. They aren't true, are they?" "I don't know what they have been saying," replied her sister, "but there's nothing you need to trouble about. Are you still at Speke and Burnham's?" "No," replied the girl. "I've got another place." "Where?" "At another firm in the city." "Good pay?" "The same as I had before." "And that girl, Chellew, isn't she called? She's not living with you, is she? Emily Barnes says but I won't tell you." "No, she's gone away," replied Eleanor calmly. "But another girl lives with me now, one who is in the same office." "Is she nice?" "She's rather colourless and altogether uninteresting, but she's all right. Tell me about yourself. Why have you come here to live?" A flush mounted Peggy's cheeks. "Oh," she said, "I'm so miserable." "Tell me about it." "Jim said we could not afford to live in a place of our own, and it's too horrible to think about." "Why? Aren't they kind to you?" "It's not that so much. They seem to have different feelings. They don't understand, you know. But there, I'm glad to have you. They'll be calling us down to tea in a few minutes, but I just wanted to get you up here alone first. Have you heard from father and mother?" "Not often," replied Eleanor. "They came to see me soon after I left home. I told you about that. They've written to me twice since, and I replied that I preferred to stay where I was, and to be alone. Then John wrote, asking if he might come to see me, and I told him no." Peggy gave a quivering sigh. "Do you know Trev's home?" she asked. "He's engaged." "Is he? Do we know the girl?" "No, but they say she's wonderful." "How do you know?" "They came to see me. That is, father and mother did, before I came here." "Tell me about it," cried Eleanor eagerly. "Why did they come to see you? Did they say anything about me?" Then Peggy, unable to contain herself further, told her sister the story of the past few months. "And they asked you to go home?" "Yes, and oh, I did so long to go." "Why didn't you?" "Would you?" "How could I? They refused to have anything to do with Jim. They have insulted him again and again, and after what I had said to them, I could not." "I wish you'd let me know how poor you were," said Eleanor presently. "I would have helped you." "But I thought you had only just enough to pay your way." "Yes, but I would have managed to help you somehow." "Would you? Oh, but I could not take anything. I couldn't really. I say, Eleanor, it hasn't been a great success, has it?" Eleanor was silent. "Why haven't you been to see me?" asked Peggy presently. Still the other girl did not speak. "Oh, you need not be afraid to tell me," and Peggy noted her sister's looks. "I know what you feel. You never liked Jim, I know, and now it's worse than ever." "Do you still like him?" asked Eleanor. "Is he kind to you?" "Of course he's kind to me," lied Peggy, in an attempt to be loyal. "And of course I'm fond of him, but—" "Yes?" "It's being here," the girl almost sobbed. "His mother and sisters are just awful. Sometimes I think they mean to be kind, but they don't understand. They seem to think that father and mother should come to see them, and should make Jim an allowance. They laugh at what they call my pride, because I won't write home for help. If I could only get away, if we two could be together. But you have told me nothing about yourself, and I want to know. Do you see much of Tamsin Cory now?" "No." "Why not? Have you quarrelled?" "I don't see anything of her anyhow." "Do you go to the Amazon Club?" "No, I haven't been for a long time." "Why?" "I haven't, that's all." "Oh, Eleanor, I do wish I could go home." "Why don't you?" "I can't. You know I can't. I could not leave Jim, and they won't have him. I say, couldn't we manage to live together? You say you have a fairly good salary, and if Jim could find a cheap place, couldn't you come and live with us? We might manage then." "I must think about it," replied Eleanor after a long silence. "Perhaps it might be managed." "I know you don't like Jim," persisted Peggy, "but I wish you could. I would do anything to get away from these people here. It's not only Jim's sisters, but their young men who come to see them. They're simply awful. They expect me to laugh at their jokes and to be friendly with them, but I can't. I simply can't. You'll see them presently, and then you'll understand. There, tea is ready. Mrs. Barnes is coming for us." "Come now, you two girls," said Mrs. Barnes, entering the room. "Tea is ready. How are you, Miss Trelawney?" holding out her hand to Eleanor. "Glad to see you, I'm sure. I expected you to come here a lot after Jim and your sister were married. I'm not the one to bear malice. I say let's be friends, but come down right away. Tea's all on the table, and I don't keep it after 5 o'clock to please nobody, especially on a Sunday afternoon." Evidently the occasion was intended to be an important one. A round table, too large for the room, had been placed in the centre of what they called their drawing room, and was covered with a large amount of eatables. Chairs were drawn up all round it as if for a large party. No sooner had Eleanor and Peggy come down than Emily and Edith Barnes, followed by their swains, came out of the back room, while Jim Barnes stood at the foot of the stairs waiting to receive them. "Hello, Eleanor!" cried Barnes with a great show of heartiness. "Now this is what I call something like. I'm sure I'm pleased to see you. How are you? What, not one kiss for your brother-in-law? Come now, I say, I must salute my sister with a brotherly kiss." And Barnes put his hand on her shoulder as if to carry his words into effect. "Yes, and why not?" said Mrs. Barnes, as Eleanor drew away. "I'm sure nothing could be more natural. My husband's brother, Andrew Barnes, he was a clerk in a surveyor's office, he was, always came to see us twice a week after we were married, and he never failed to kiss me. I should have thought it funny if he hadn't." "Nothing doing, Jim?" cried Emily's swain, a young man who rejoiced in the name of Sam Pilling. "I say, that's too bad." Sam Pilling was Emily Barnes's latest conquest. Both the young men who were at Primrose Terrace on the night General Trelawney first returned from abroad had long since been forgotten. "But I think the young lady's quite right," went on Pilling. "Kissing ain't for public, I say. It's a private affair. What do you say, Miss Trelawney?" "Well, kissing or no kissing," interposed Mrs. Barnes, "it's tea time, and I hate tea when it's overbrewed or when it gets cold. Overbrewed tea always gives me indigestion. As for cold tea, it's just horrible. There now, sit down. The table is rather small for so many of us, so you'll have to squeeze up." "Not the slightest objection to squeezing, Mrs. Barnes," laughed Pilling. "Indeed, I think it's okay. There now, we're all snug and comfortable. Plenty of room, haven't you, Miss Trelawney? Tell me if I'm squeezing you too tight." At this there was a general titter, although Emily Barnes was much annoyed that Pilling should have chosen to sit beside Eleanor instead of herself. "Eleanor won't mind," remarked Emily when the laughter had subsided. "Will you?" The girl was saved the pain of answering by Mrs. Barnes asking in a loud voice who would and who would not have sugar. "Look here, mother," said Barnes, after that lady had finished pouring out tea, "this cake and stuff is all very well, but both Pilling and Leatherhead have come all the way from Balham, and they'll be a bit peckish. Haven't you got anything more substantial?" "Oh, yes," replied Mrs. Barnes cheerfully. "I boiled a bit of 'am yesterday, and it's on the sideboard in the other room. If anybody would like to have a bit of 'am, say so. Will you, Eleanor, my dear? Make yourself quite at home. You're one of the family, and I'm not going to call you Miss Trelawney any more. Jim," shouted Mrs. Barnes to her son, who had gone to cut the ham, "there's some mustard in the cupboard, and pepper and salt too, if anybody wants it. But I'm afraid it's too much of a crush to have the pickles out." "Aren't you having any ham, Miss Trelawney?" asked Pilling, who was vigorously plying his knife and fork. His people originally came from Yorkshire, where what they called high teas are common. Eleanor replied in the negative. "Oh, well, London ways are all very well," remarked Pilling, "but give me old Yorkshire. It may be a bit rough up there, but we know what's what." In her endeavour to be agreeable, Eleanor entered into conversation with Pilling, who seemed to find her company vastly entertaining. Indeed, he became so interested in what Eleanor said that he paid but little attention to Emily Barnes on the other side of the table. As a consequence, that lady became jealous. In addition, she had anything but kindly feelings towards Eleanor. She remembered the conversation between them on Hampstead Heath some time before, which had rankled ever since. "She thinks she's honouring us by being here to tea," she reflected, "but I'll pay her out before long." "Now this is what I like," remarked Mrs. Barnes presently. "All the children 'ome and everybody 'appy. Yes, I know things are terribly dear, but dear as they are, I 'ope everybody will have a good meal. That's what my poor husband used to say when people came in to have a bite with us. 'Cut and come again' was his motto. Ah, but things are different now from what they were then." "I say," said Leatherhead, who, sitting next to Edith Barnes, was enjoying himself vastly, "couldn't the whole lot of us do a theatre to-morrow night? Come now, Mrs. Barnes, couldn't you shut up the house for one evening? There's a good piece on at the Lyceum, and nothing would please me better than to pay for 2 or 3 seats. What do you say, Pilling?" "I'm game," said Pilling, "and I've heard the play's a good one. Plenty of fighting and spying and mystery. That's the sort of thing I like. What do you say, Miss Trelawney? I'm sure it will give me great pleasure to take you." "I'm afraid I can't," replied Eleanor. "But why? Have you another engagement?" "Of course she has," said Emily Barnes, who thought she saw a chance of paying that stuck-up Trelawney girl out, as she called it. "The Lyceum is too tame for her. She prefers going to the Frivolity with Mr. Wakeham, and to some place to supper afterwards. By the way, how is Mr. Wakeham, Eleanor?" "Come, come, Emily, that's going a bit too far," interposed Barnes. "Why is it going too far?" asked Emily, by this time madly jealous at the attention her lover was paying Eleanor. "She does go to the Frivolity with Mr. Wakeham, and a man I know told me he saw them at supper at the Azure Sky, one of those fast night clubs that was raided. Of course Mr. Wakeham is a married man, but that doesn't matter, does it? Come now, it's no use getting huffy about it. We know what we know." A flush of shame surmounted the girl's face, and she did not know what to say. She felt as though her horrible experiences of the evening to which Emily referred must be known to all London, and she would have given anything to have got out of the room. Her previous experiences during the afternoon were painful enough, but she felt that this was more than she could bear. "And what if a girl does go out for an evening's enjoyment?" cried Pilling, who evidently admired Eleanor very much. "As far as I know, there's no harm in the friv, or going out for a bit of supper and a hop afterwards. Everybody does it these days." "Some people seem very lucky," sneered Emily. "It isn't every typist that can drink champagne with their suppers." "No, it isn't," laughed Pilling. "I wish I could get it sometimes." "Now, if we've all finished tea," broke in Mrs. Barnes, "you'd better get into the other room. Peggy and I will wash up the tea things. Now, Miss Trelawney, you must not take any notice of Emily. She's a bit tart with her tongue, but she doesn't mean anything wrong. Go into the sitting room and make yourself at home. There's a nice fire there." "I'm afraid I can't stay any longer," replied Eleanor. "I must go." "But not yet," objected Mrs. Barnes. "It's only just turned 6." "Thank you, I really must get back." "Well, if you will, you will," assented Mrs. Barnes after a great many protestations had been made. "But I don't see any reason why. We expected you to spend the evening with us." "I'll see you home anyhow," said Barnes. "No, no, please don't trouble," replied Eleanor. "I can quickly get to the station from here." "Couldn't think of it," persisted Barnes. "What, see my own sister-in-law go home alone? No, indeed, that wouldn't do." "But I really prefer it," urged the girl. "I couldn't think of your leaving Peg." "Oh, Peg's all right. I often leave her of an evening. You see, she has mother now. I'll put on my overcoat right away." "But I really couldn't dream of it," said Eleanor with a note in her voice which even Barnes could not help noticing. "Do you mean to say you'd rather not have me?" he said with heightened voice. "Very well, I'm not the one to push my company upon anyone." "Oh, please don't take it that way," said Eleanor, who was anxious for Peggy's sake not to have any unpleasantness. "But I really would prefer to be alone." "Of course she would," laughed Emily. "No doubt she has her engagements, Jim, and although you have married a girl without a penny to her name, the Trelawneys think themselves superior to the Barnes." Peggy had listened to all this in positive agony. She had heard a garbled account of what Emily Barnes had said to her sister when they met on Hampstead Heath, but she had no idea that the girl would have said such things before others. She saw how every word had cut Eleanor like a knife, saw the anger and pain which she had tried to suppress. "Emily!" she cried passionately, "I did not bring my sister here to be insulted. Had I known, she should not have come." "Well, we didn't want her," retorted Emily. "We may be common people, but we are respectable. Stick up for your family, Jim. Talk about insult indeed. We don't go to night clubs with married men. Of course, she wouldn't let you kiss her, Jim, but I'll warrant she was not so particular about Mr. Wakeham. Her own brother-in-law isn't good enough for her." "Oh, do let me get out of this," cried Eleanor, losing control over herself. "Put on your hat and come with me to the station, Peg." "That's it, is it?" shouted Barnes. "You wouldn't let me come with you, but you'll drag Peg out. I'm going to have a kiss before you go." What happened after that, Eleanor could hardly tell. She remembered a wild struggle with Barnes, and presently found herself in the street, with Peggy by her side. As they neared Camden Town Station, she grew calmer. "I couldn't, Peg. Really, I couldn't," she said. "Couldn't what?" asked Peggy. "Couldn't live with you and that man. Forgive me, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I really couldn't." Peggy was silent. She realized what was in her sister's mind, and while she felt somewhat angry, she could not blame her. "I hate the thought of you going back to them," said Eleanor presently. "It's horrible, simply too horrible," ejaculated the other. "Look here, come with me to live. We could manage somehow. I need not pay any more for rooms. You shall sleep with me, as you used to when we were kiddies, and perhaps I could find you work." Peggy's eyes flashed at this, and for a moment she seemed as though she would accept her sister's suggestion. She shook her head despondently, however. "No," she said, "I can't leave Jim. But forgive me for asking you there. If I had known—" "Oh, never mind me," interrupted her sister. "I'm all right. It's you I'm thinking about. Come and see me often, Peg. I nearly always stay in of an evening now, and I get home from business at 6:30. "I dare not," replied the girl. "They say things bad enough to me now." When she returned to Primrose Terrace, she went straight to her bedroom and sat there in the dark. Barnes heard her come in, and when she didn't come downstairs and join the others, he went to her. "What are you moping here for?" he asked angrily. "Why don't you come down with the rest and be pleasant?" "I want to be alone, Jim," was her reply. "Alone? Why do you want to be alone? Oh, you're thinking about Eleanor, I suppose. Well, what business had she to be so hoity-toity?" Peg did not reply. "Aren't you going to speak? Aren't you coming down with the others and be pleasant?" Still she was silent. "Oh, hang your dirty pride," he said with an oath. "Well, if I can't have a bit of comfort here, I shall go where I can." Soon after, he left the house. After that, Peggy's life became a perfect misery. Mrs. Barnes upbraided her with being utterly useless, besides being a drag on the family. "If you'd only be sensible," said Mrs. Barnes, "Jim would like you better, but how can he care about a girl who is always peevish and never brings a penny to help? Oh, I tell you straight, we are not going to stand it much longer. The girls are complaining too, and say the place isn't like home any longer. If you want to keep Jim, you'd better swallow your pride and get your family to help you. What would a few pounds a week be to them? Nothing, and it would be a great deal to us." As for Barnes, he seldom stayed in the house at night. When he came home from work, he partook of his food in silence, and then went out alone, while Mrs. Barnes and her daughters would look at each other significantly. "Do you know where Jim goes to?" asked Peggy on one occasion. "He won't tell me." "Oh, he goes where he can have pleasant society," retorted Emily. "It's no use saying I like it," said Mrs. Barnes woefully, "but Jim was always that way, and I've always said that he liked Agnes best of all the girls he kept company with. Of course she has a nice house too, and nobody would be pleasanter or more entertaining than Jim when he's a mind to." A little later Peggy realized that an air of mystery prevailed in the house. There was nothing definite upon which she could fasten, but from the sudden silence which fell upon Mrs. Barnes and her daughters whenever she entered the room, she could not help realizing that they were discussing matters about which they did not wish her to know. "Have you seen your sister lately?" asked Mrs. Barnes of her one day. "I've only seen her once since she was here," replied Peggy. "But you should, my dear," urged the woman with a show of friendliness. "We don't want to be a disturbing element between relations. Of course she thinks herself too good to come here again." "And we think ourselves too good to have her," snapped Emily. "Still, I say you ought to go and see her sometimes," continued Mrs. Barnes. At that moment Barnes came back to his dinner, and evidently something unpleasant had happened, for he was in a bad temper. "I was just saying to Peggy that she ought to go and see her sister oftener. Why don't you spend a Saturday afternoon with her? Typists are always free of a Saturday afternoon." "Would you mind if I went, Jim?" asked Peggy, and there was eagerness in her voice. "I don't care where you go," was his reply. "You can throw yourself in the river for all I care." "Come, Jim, you don't mean that," said his mother coaxingly. "Don't mind him, Peggy, my dear. You go and have a chat with your sister. It will do you good." It came about, therefore, that on the following Saturday afternoon Peggy made her way to Eleanor's rooms. "Look here, Peg," said Eleanor, "I'm not going to ask you any questions, but we're going to have a jolly time. I have been very economical lately, and I can afford to give you a treat. We will go to a matinee of Chu Chin Chow this afternoon, and then we'll go to a nice place for tea, and after that we'll come home here and spend the evening together." "That's awfully good of you. You're sure you can afford it?" "Perfectly sure." "It will be lovely," cried Peggy, "but I must not get home later than 9 o'clock." "That can be easily managed. Come on." For nearly 3 hours the girls forgot their troubles in the brilliant spectacle at His Majesty's Theatre, and afterwards, according to Eleanor's programme, they went to a cosy tea room where they spent some time together. "We've had a glorious time," cried Peggy, when at length they reached Eleanor's room. "But, Eleanor, you don't seem happy." "Don't bother about me. I'm all right. And don't let's think of anything unpleasant. Let's talk about old times, when we were kiddies together." For more than 2 hours they chatted together as girls will. Eleanor appeared to be gay, almost hilariously so, while Peggy, forgetting for a moment her associations with Primrose Terrace, seemed something like the Peggy of old times. "Oh, if we could only live together, Eleanor! If we could only spend our evenings like this!" "But we can't," replied the other. "I must say it, Peg. I simply could not stand that man. I know you have married him, but he's impossible. Won't you leave him and come with me?" "No," replied Peggy. Even yet she felt she must be loyal to him. The evening before he had remained at home, and she thought he appeared kinder and more thoughtful. Just before 9 o'clock, Peggy left St. Hildebrand's Mansions for Camden Town, and she shuddered as she made her way through the cold, wintry night. It was not raining, but the air was dank and depressing. The streets were muddy and miserable. As she neared the station her mind flashed, in spite of herself, to her old home. Her conversation with her sister had brought up 1,000 memories of those days before the war, when as children they laughed and romped in the great playroom. She thought of a party they had once had, when her father had come into the room dressed as Santa Claus, and had given them all sorts of presents. What fun they had! What laughter! And she had given it all up for this. She was still only a child in years, and yet she felt that her childhood was passing from her, and that she had nothing to look forward to but a lifetime's association with the Barnes family. How mad she had been! Not only mad, but wicked. For she had been wicked. She felt it now. She remembered the look on her father's face as she saw him last, realized how old and how haggard he appeared. And yet he had been kind and loving through it all. Then she thought of her mother, thought also of the way she had defied her and threatened her, and why had she done it? How had it all ended? Would Barnes be home when she arrived at Primrose Terrace? She did not expect him. She almost hoped he would not be. Oh, the horror of the place, the miserable, squalid, coarse, common horror of it all. Yes, she had been a fool, and worse than a fool. She, too, had been common and vulgar. She had been enamoured of people of whom she now felt ashamed. Fancy introducing Barnes to her father's friends. But more than that, she had been wicked. Yes, Positively wicked. She had saddened the lives of both her father and her mother. Again her mind flashed back to the old home of her childhood, and she remembered how her father used to put her to bed and listen to her while she said her prayers. She called to mind the words with which she always finished her prayers. God bless Daddy and Mummy and Trev and John and Eleanor, and make me a good girl, and bless everybody and make them happy, for Christ's sake. Amen. She had laughed at all this. Now she was going back to Camden Town, to Primrose Terrace, and to the Barnes family. She left the train at Camden Town and found her way through the dismal, muddy streets to Primrose Terrace. When she arrived at number 13, she found the place in darkness. What did it mean? Mrs. Barnes never went out in the evening, although the girls always went to the pictures on a Saturday evening, and generally returned about 10:30 with their young men. She tried the door. It was locked, and silence reigned in the house. The houses on either side of number 13 were also in darkness. What should she do? Perhaps Mrs. Barnes thought she would not be home until late, and had gone with her daughters to the movies. She remembered a picture palace in the main street, not far away. She would go there and spend an hour. By that time Mrs. Barnes would have returned. A little later she had partially forgotten her troubles in watching an impossible story being reproduced on the screen. Then, when it was over, she came out into the street again. A clock near by struck 10:30. She hurried back to Primrose Terrace, and found that number 13 was still in darkness. What could it mean? They knew she was out, and she had told them she should return about 9 o'clock. She seized the rusty knocker and rapped at the door. There was no response. She knocked louder. Still no answer. She began to be frightened. Something had happened, and with a kind of frenzy she knocked still louder. Then she heard a movement in the adjoining house, and the door opened. "Who's that?" "It's I, Mrs. Simpkins, Mrs. Jim Barnes." "Oh, it's you, is it? Well, Mrs. Barnes asked me to tell you when you came back that she and her girls had gone away for a bit of an holiday." "But where?" "I don't know nothing about that. She said they might be away several days. I expect this letter will tell you all you want to know. She asked me to give it to you if you should come. Good night. Dark, ain't it?" And the woman sniggered meaningly. Peggy took the letter like one in a dream. She was too bewildered to readily comprehend the meaning of it all. She walked to the nearest lamp post and opened the letter. It was in Barnes's handwriting, but there was no address or signature. "I've had enough of it," she read, "and so I expect have you. If you want your liberty, you can easily get it. I'm going my way, and you can go yours." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 29. Peggy's Betrayal. Bewildered as she was, Peggy had to read this letter more than once before the full meaning of it burst upon her. Presently, however, she understood. Barnes was tired of her, and had thrown her off like an old glove, his family conniving at the action he had taken. She saw now why they were so anxious for her to go see her sister, and understood why they told her not to come back until 9 o'clock. They had made this an opportunity whereby they could be rid of her, not caring what became of her. Oh, the horror, the degradation of it! For some time she did not know what she was doing, or where she was going. She only knew that she was adrift in London, and that she, the daughter of General Trelawney, was alone and unprotected in the London streets, a castaway. What could she do? Where could she go? A sense of utter desolation and misery possessed her, and she was ashamed beyond words. At that moment she scarcely cared what happened to her. She was not yet 19 years of age, and what had the future for her? Up to now she had, in spite of everything, refused to be anything but loyal to Barnes. She had excused his words of cruelty. She had fought against the loathing which sometimes filled her when she realized that she was wedded to him for life. In her way, and in spite of all her faults, she had tried to think kindly of him, and to be loving to him. For his sake she had refused to share Eleanor's offered hospitality. Ay, and more than that, for his sake she had refused to go to her own home. For his sake, too, she had borne with his sister's sneers and gibes, and his mother's constant insults. And now it had come to this. What could she do? Again the question haunted her. She remembered what Barnes had said only 2 nights before, when she had suggested spending the afternoon with her sister. "You can throw yourself in the river," he had snarled. "I don't care what you do." Well, why not? Life had nothing to offer her. She would not go to Eleanor and tell her what had taken place. She simply could not. She could see the look that would come into her sister's eyes, the bitter smile that would curl on her lips. For a long time she walked, unheeding whither she went. Then presently she realized that she had passed from the streets and had entered an open space. The wind had risen, and dark clouds were being swept across the sky. Above her head she saw patches of blue, and here and there a star shining. Why, this was Hampstead Heath. She was near home, not more than 5 minutes' walk from her father's house. Almost instinctively she thought of the morning when her father and mother had come to her, and she remembered the former's words. "Good morning, my dear. You'll remember that your father's and mother's house is always open to you." She had felt at the time that his unconscious emphasis on the last word was an insult to the man to whom she had sworn to be loyal. But now it came to her like healing balm. They still loved her. In spite of everything, she was her dad's little Peggy still. Great sobs rose to her throat, sobs which almost choked her. "What shall I do? What shall I do?" she wailed. "Oh, God, help me! Oh, if they only would! If they only would! But I dare not. I'm ashamed." Her old home seemed like heaven to her now, and the restrictions which at one time seemed so irksome were something to rejoice in. Oh, to have a home, and tenderness, and love, to be with her own people, to breathe the atmosphere of affection and refinement. Oh, God help her, if she only could. What would John say? What would Trev's fiancé say? Did her father really mean it when he told her she might come home? He was a proud man, and would shudder at anything like disgrace coming to his name, and she had disgraced it by becoming the wife of such a creature as Barnes. And yet... Then there came to her memory, like some long-forgotten dream, the words she had read in childhood and forgotten in her girlhood, a saying from the most beautiful story ever told. "I will arise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned." But could she? All the time she had been walking, she knew not whither. Then suddenly she saw a light. Yes, It was home. That was her father's house. There was a light coming from one of the windows. She crept wearily along no longer. Her feet seemed to be winged, and she rushed pantingly to the door of her old home. She knocked timidly, like one afraid. Then, as there was no answer, more loudly. She heard footsteps in the hall, firm, decided footsteps, and the door opened. "Yes, what is it?" It was her father's voice. "It's me, Dad. Peggy. Will you let me come in?" "Peggy?" "Yes, Dad. I've come home. I have no home but this. Will you have me?" In a second the General understood. He required no mental process to comprehend everything. His heart leapt to the truth. "My little Peggy!" he cried. "Come in, my darling, come in. You must be cold. Come in. There, let me see your face. Kiss your old Dad, my little girl. I am glad you have come." He drew her to the warm, well-lighted room as he spoke, and held her close to his heart, while the girl sobbed convulsively. "I didn't know I was so near. Then I saw the light. I didn't know what I was doing, but I couldn't help it. I have come home, Dad. I'm so miserable and ashamed." Her words came incoherently between great heart-breaking sobs. She scarcely knew what she was saying, but the long pent-up feelings which had been buried in her heart for months were trying to find expression. Meanwhile her father held her to his heart. His brain even yet had failed to grasp the situation, but his love made him understand everything. There, Peggy, it's all right. It's your old home, my dear. No matter what's happened, everything is right." And his voice was hoarse because his heart was in a wild tumult. I'm so ashamed," stammered Peggy, but I couldn't help coming. Something drew me here in spite of myself. When I found out what I was, what it all meant, I think I went mad. I didn't know where I was going. I thought I would go to the river and throw myself into the water. There seemed nothing else for me. Then I saw I was on the heath, and I didn't know where I was going, although I kept on walking. Then I saw the light. Will you have me, Dad? I know I've been a bad girl, but I couldn't help coming home. Something made me." "Have you? Of course I'll have you. There, my darling, don't fear anything. Your old Dad is here. He will keep you safe. There, sit before the fire and let me pull off your wet, cold boots. Then I'll go to your mother and tell her you have come home." He drew her to an armchair as he spoke, and took off her hat and jacket. "Are you better now, my little Peg?" he went on, scarcely realizing what he was saying or doing. "You're cold and hungry, aren't you? There now, don't cry. It's all right. I'll go and fetch mother." No, not yet," sobbed the girl. "What shall I do for you, then? I'm so glad to see you, Peg. Is there anything you want? I'll get mother here in a minute. She'll know better than I what to do." No, not yet," persisted Peggy. "Please, Dad," she sobbed. "Let me sit on your knee like I used to. I haven't sat on your knee since before the war, and "Yes, my darling," said the General, whose eyes were brimming with tears. "That's it. There now, sit on my knee, and put your arms round my neck as you used to years ago, and tell me everything." She laid her head on his shoulder like a tired, broken-hearted child, and then she sobbed out her story, such a pitiful story, so common, yet so tragic. She told it between heart-broken sobs and exclamations of shame and sorrow. "And is that all?" asked the General at length. "That's all, except that I want to be with you, and I want mother." "Of course you do. It's all right. Your old dad is gladder than words can tell to have you back. Yes, I understand what you feel. It's all a miserable business. But never mind, you have come home now. There, there, kiss me again, my dear." But do you really forgive me? Do you really mean to say that you'll have me here, just as if I hadn't been so wicked? For, oh, I have been so miserable, so ashamed, and I do want to be good, and I do want mother." "Of course you do." The General half laughed and half sobbed out the words. "Don't be afraid, Peggy. We'll make everything right. The old miserable past is over, and in some way we'll begin anew. There, there, I'll go and fetch mother." He rushed away as he spoke, while the child looked around the room she had known all her life. There were the old books, the old pictures, the old furniture. Everything she saw seemed to bid her welcome. Everything seemed to tell her of an undying love. This was home, the home which in her madness and in her wickedness she had left, but which was now the haven of refuge for which she so longed. She heard murmuring voices and hasty footsteps, and then she knew she was in her mother's arms. She heard her mother's voice, felt the warm kisses on her cheek. She wanted to explain, wanted to, she knew not what. "Oh, mother, he's left me, and it's wrong, I know, but I'm glad he has. I could not go to him again, even if he wanted me. It's all been so awful, so horrible." "Of course it has," cried Mrs. Trelawney. She seemed to know what to do better than her husband. There was that touch of intimacy, knowledge, and innate wisdom which helps to make the crooked places straight and the rough places plain. "Of course you mustn't cry. What is there to cry about? You've come home, my darling. And, Lester, can't you see that the poor child is tired and faint? The servants have gone to bed, but that doesn't matter. Oh, yes, it's no use telling me, Peggy. I know you're hungry. I'll go and get something for you." There was healing in every word, in every tone, in every movement. The child's bitter, wounded, bleeding heart felt it, and understood. There were no reproachful questions, no upbraidings, no saying, "I told you so." The time for these things might come later, but now it was heartfelt gladness, a welcome home which her poor little soul longed for. "No, no, I'm not going to let you talk to me about all those miserable things," cried the mother, as Peggy again tried to return to her sordid tale of the past few months. "There's no need for that now, and you must not trouble a bit about the future. We shall be able to talk about that some other time. All that matters now is that you are here, my darling." "I was afraid that you would be away," sobbed Peggy. "It seemed strange that you should be up so late." "I could not go to bed," said the General. "I don't know why, but I felt as though I must sit up." The door opened again, and John entered. "Hello, Peg, old girl," said the boy, rather awkwardly. "Good business. I thought I heard your voice, so I put on these clothes over my pajamas and came down." "Yes, Peg's come home," cried the General. "Come to stay. Isn't it splendid?" "He left me this," said Peggy piteously, handing John the letter which Barnes had written. "I've been staying with his mother, and Jack, don't look like that." For John had read the letter by this time and knew the whole truth as if by intuition. "The mean, dirty swine! But it's all right, Peg. He'll never trouble you any more," said the boy, speaking awkwardly, but with a look shining from his eyes which made Peggy understand in spite of everything. "Of course it's going to be all right," said Mrs. Trelawney. "Of course it's going to be all right," said Mrs. Trelawney. "Are you quite warm now, darling? Will you have something more to eat?" "No, no, Mother. Don't mind my crying, but it's all so beautiful. I never knew before how beautiful it was. Dad, you're sure it's you, aren't you? You're sure I'm home, really? Will you let me get on your knee again? And, Dad, you're sure you forgive me, aren't you? I have been wicked, but I do want to be a good girl." The General took her on his knee again. "There, there, my little Peggy, snuggle up close to me just as you did in the old days, when I used to tell you stories before I put you to bed. Is that all right?" "It's just beautiful, Dad," she sobbed. "Just beautiful." Unmindful of the time, they sat together talking. Little by little, Peggy became calmer, and in spite of their protests, she insisted on telling her story again, such a mean, miserable story. She seemed to want to unburden her heart, to throw from her life the experiences of the last few months. It might be as though she were a little child again, a little kiddie who had been naughty, but now entered the happiness which comes through forgiveness. But it was more than that, and although they said nothing of it, each knew it. Especially did the General feel that, although his little Peggy had come home, contrite and repentant, that he, with all his love, could never wipe out the past. He saw by her shudders, and by her expression of loathing when Barnes's name was mentioned, the misery and the truth. He could not undo the fact that in many senses his child's life was ruined, and that in the days to come she would feel the pollution of her association with the man with whom she had been madly infatuated. But he would not upbraid her. He would try, as far as in him lay, to destroy the effect of those miserable months. He knew she had destroyed much of her girlhood. She had made her future black with a kind of shame which she could not express, and she would be forever haunted by the thought that her life had been contaminated with evil. She had come back, but it could never be as though she had never gone away. There were still the months which the locusts had eaten. But he kept all that from Peggy. In spite of everything, his heart went out to her with a great, overwhelming love, and the thought of her contrition and her penitence went far to atone for the pain she had caused him. "We must get Trev home," he cried. "I'm sure it can be managed. And we must get Mary Penryn up here too. You'll like her, Peg." "Yes, she's a ripping girl," was John's emphasis. "You must get her up here tomorrow, Dad. I'll bring her up to lunch if you like. I'll run down with the car for her tomorrow morning." "And now we won't talk any longer," said Mrs. Trelawney. "I can see you're tired." "I feel as though I shall never be tired again," sobbed Peggy. "I'll bet you are. I insist on you going to bed now." A few minutes later Peggy was in her own bedroom, the bedroom she had known from childhood. Oh, how beautiful, how restful everything was! She recognized every article in the room. Nothing seemed to have been changed since she left it. It had been furnished according to her own desires and tastes. The colorings were perfect, everything accorded with everything else, and it was all so sweet and restful. An air of refinement prevailed, too. Everything was so different from the vulgar squalor of Primrose Terrace. "Is everything all right, Peggy?" asked her mother. "Kneel with me as I say my prayers," she sobbed, "just as you used to do in the old days, Mother. I've been a wicked girl, but I will be good. Oh, I will be good." Side by side they knelt, while the mother, scarcely less moved than her child, put her arm round her. "Please, God, forgive me, and help me to be a good girl." It was the old prayer of her childhood which came back to her, and for the moment she felt like a child again, and after all she was but little more. But her childhood had gone, and she knew it, and although she could not put it into words, she felt the tragedy of it. "There now, go to sleep," said her mother, as Peggy nestled among the clean white sheets. "We shall be here in the morning." "May I come in, Peggy?" "Yes, Dad, please come." The General knelt beside the bed and kissed her. "God bless you, my little girl," he said, and his voice broke. "Good night. We'll meet in the morning." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 30. At Spurling and King's. Eleanor Trelawney had said but little to her sister about her own experiences. She had told her nothing of the episode which had so frightened her. Neither had she mentioned Rod Ravenscroft in any way. On the morning following Ravenscroft's visit, she had received a letter from Ellen Chellew, telling her that she did not intend to return to the flat again, and asking her to forward her things to a given address. As Eleanor read the letter she felt the tragedy of it, and instead of doing what she had been asked, she wrote a long letter to Ellen, beseeching her to come back. Her eyes were being opened. But her letter was sent in vain. 2 days later she received another epistle from Ellen, to the effect that she had counted the cost of her action, and that she did not intend to be tied down to puritanical notions. As for Eleanor herself, her mind was in a condition difficult to describe. Her experiences on the night when Ravenscroft had rescued her from a position which she shrank from thinking about had somehow revolutionized her whole being. She could not understand the infatuation which women of the Tamsin Cory class had had over her. The sudden revelation of her feelings in regard to Rod Ravenscroft had changed everything. Never had Eleanor realized the helplessness of her future as she realized it now. For years she had rather gloried in the idea that men had no attraction for her. She had been pleased when she had been referred to as sexless. The whole idea of giving her life to any man was utterly out of accord with her philosophy of life. For that reason she had been largely oblivious to Ravenscroft's real feelings towards her, and if she had known, she would not have cared. Of course she was very young, and had been well nigh carried off her feet by Tamsin Cory, and was under the spell of women who proclaimed the new era of moral and intellectual liberty which had hitherto been denied to her sex. Then followed the events which are outlined in this narrative. With all a foolish girl's confidence in her own powers, she had seen no danger in her associations with Wakeham. Other women had their men friends. Why not she? It was true she did not like Wakeham. He struck her as a coarse, somewhat unpleasant specimen of the man about town. but she reflected that he might be helpful to her, especially in view of Peggy's difficulties. But she was not afraid. Her own feelings were entirely platonic, and she laughed at the idea that she, Eleanor Trelawney, who had always been spoken of as cold as an icicle, would be unable to take care of herself. Up to that time she was as determined as ever not to submit to the restrictions of home life, neither did she repent of the step she had taken. Of course, she missed many of the refinements and comforts of her father's house at Hampstead, but in their place she had her liberty, and she was able to live her own life. Then came that awful moment when Rod Ravenscroft had rescued her from the ghastly position in which she had found herself. She realized the horror she had of such men as Wakeham, realized, too, how they regarded women. Of course, one thing had been made plain to her. She was no longer able to go to Speke and Burnham's. She imagined that in any case Wakeham would make it impossible, but even if he desired her to retain her old position, she could not do so. She therefore wrote to the firm, resigning her position. But what to do she did not know. She had but very little money, and how to live was a question which stared her in the face. On the Monday she diligently searched the advertisements in the newspaper for something that might suit her. Many of these advertisements she answered, sometimes in writing, sometimes in person, but nothing came of them. Positions no longer went begging, and there seemed to be half a dozen applicants for every one that was open. At the end of a week she was well nigh in despair. That she must leave St. Hildebrand's Mansions was evident. Shabby and uncomfortable as her rooms were, she could not pay for them. Indeed, as she looked at the rapidly diminishing contents of her purse, a great terror possessed her. Then suddenly great good fortune came to her. She received a letter from a well-known firm in the city, signed by one of the partners, which seemed to her like a message from heaven. She could not understand it. What could such a firm as Spurling and King know of her? She was not aware that these people were cognizant of her existence, yet the letter before her was plain enough. "Dear Madam," it ran, "we are given to understand that you have left Messrs. Speke and Burnham, where you acted as secretary to Mr. Wakeham of that firm. As I am in need of a secretary, and as I judge, from what I have heard of your capabilities, you would be able to do the work I require, I shall be glad, if you are open to consider the situation which I offer, if you will call at the above address to-morrow morning at 10:30. Yours faithfully, Alfred Spurling." The news seemed too good to be true. Surely it must be a hoax. But no, it could not be. It was written on the firm's note-paper, and bore every sign of genuineness. Spurling and King was an old established firm of merchants. It was on the highest pedestal of respectability, and was known for its soundness and its old-fashioned ways. She had heard it spoken of as a firm which had fought long against modern innovations, and had for years refused to adopt either the telephone or the typewriter. Of course she would go. There was an old-world courtesy manifest in the letter which cheered her in spite of herself. When she arrived at the offices of Spurling and King, she was impressed by the atmosphere of the place. Everything was quiet and orderly. The furniture of the offices was somewhat old, but it suggested security and respectability. There was none of the rush and hurry which she had seen at Speke and Burnham's. Most of the clerks were middle-aged men. Some, indeed, were quite old, and looked as though they had been there all their lives. "Will you come this way?" said the man who looked at the paper on which her name and business were written. "Mr. Spurling is expecting you." A minute later she was ushered into a spacious office, which seemed so quiet and restful that it might have been far away from the great rushing life of the metropolis. The furniture of the room was rich and costly. Thickly piled carpets covered the floor. Great heavy mahogany desks and cases were placed around the room. Everything spoke of prosperity and order. Seated at a desk not far from a glowing fire sat a portly, white-haired old gentleman who looked at her steadily for a few seconds through his gold-rimmed spectacles. He might have been from 65 to 70 years of age, and had a benign, placid appearance, which reminded Eleanor of the prosperous, old-time merchant of 100 years ago. There was no suggestion of the get-rich-quick kind of man in this old gentleman. He was not the sort who would touch risky speculations, neither would he connive at shady transactions. Possibly his father and grandfather drove to the city in the old days before trains and telegraphs, behind a spanking pair of horses, from some comfortable country mansion situated a few miles from London. "Miss Eleanor Trelawney?" he queried, as he looked at the paper which the man had left with him. The girl nervously assented. "Good old-fashioned names, both of them," remarked the old gentleman with a smile. "Any relation of the Trelawney family of Cornwall?" "I believe we are distantly connected," replied the girl, "but we don't know them." "No, but it's a good old-fashioned name, anyhow. But you are not old-fashioned, I take it, Miss Trelawney." "I don't quite understand you, sir," ventured Eleanor. "I dare say you don't. What I meant was that you have broken away from the old traditions concerning a woman's place and work. I hear you are an excellent stenographer and typist, that you understand bookkeeping, and have quite an intimate knowledge of affairs generally. I hear, too, that you know a good deal about shipping." "A little," replied Eleanor. "Let me see how much." And forthwith he put to the girl a number of questions, technical as well as general, about the great shipping industries of the world. While he did so, he was no longer the placid, benign old gentleman, but the keen man of affairs, who had his finger on the pulse of the world's commerce. "Yes," he said with a smile, when that part of his catechism was over, "for a young lady you know a great deal. Where and how did you learn it?" Eleanor told him. "I see," he went on, "but even with the facilities you have had, it requires a good deal of intelligence to learn so much in such a short time. But what about your stenography and typing? I want to know something of that. I may tell you that I am very particular about my letters, and about the way drafts of contracts are drawn up. I make a strong point of punctuation and paragraphing. Sometimes, too, I dictate very rapidly, and I require such intelligence and education on the part of my secretary as will enable her to interpret my meaning as well as the exact words I utter. In short, I hate the idea of an automaton and desire an intelligent secretary. Do you mind if I put you to the test?" A minute later Eleanor was seated at a table writing rapidly, while the old gentleman walked to and fro, dictating a technical document. "There," he said, at the end of 10 minutes. "If you'll get that transcribed, I shall see whether you can help me in the way I desire." Eleanor seated herself before the typewriter and commenced her work. At first she was so excited and nervous that she made many mistakes, but before she reached the end of the page she was in full possession of her faculties again. She, therefore, threw the page away and commenced a new one. At the end of half an hour she had the document all ready. The old gentleman read it carefully, word by word, noting each paragraph, each colon, each semicolon, each full stop. "Yes," he said at length, "this will do very well. You work carefully and rapidly. There are no scratchings out, no smudges. There's not only education here, but intelligence. As far as I can see, I shall not have to make a single alteration." He stood for a few minutes as if thinking deeply. "Do you like this kind of work, Miss Trelawney?" "No," replied the girl. "Then why do you do it?" "Forgive me, I did not speak quite accurately," replied Eleanor. "I do like it in a way. The drudgery of typewriting is not pleasant, but there is real interest in the human side of business. It appeals to the imagination. It widens one's outlook. Besides, one must do what one can." "Yes, yes, I see." It might have been that questions of a personal nature were hanging upon his lips, but he did not ask them. Perhaps his conception of the courtesy due to a lady prevented him. "I think you may regard yourself as engaged, Miss Trelawney," he said presently. "Thank you. I will do my best." "Yes," said the old gentleman after a pause. "You were on the point of asking me something. What is it?" "I was wondering if you did not require references," said Eleanor with a painful blush. Something, she knew not what, dragged the words from her. "References? Ah, yes, of course. But you are a daughter of General Lester Trelawney, are you not?" "Yes." "He bears a great name, a good name. With regard to your business abilities, I have satisfied myself. And of course the daughter of General Trelawney should not need to be recommended. Still, perhaps you would not mind my writing to your father." "I would rather you did not," replied Eleanor. "Ah, why?" "I would rather you did not," she repeated. "I'm sorry for that." "I want to be absolutely frank with you, Mr. Spurling," said Eleanor. "I have left my father's house." "Dear, dear, wasn't he kind to you?" "No, no, I recall that question. I had no right to ask it." "I think you had," replied the girl. "All the same, I'd rather not answer it." She felt ashamed of herself. Why, she did not know, except that there was something in this courtly, old-fashioned gentleman's demeanour which made her feel that she had done something unworthy. In a way he reminded her of her father, although he was altogether different from him. There was no suggestion of military precision such as she had associated with her father. Instead of being tall, spare, upright, the very embodiment of a British soldier, Mr. Spurling was portly and somewhat homely in his appearance, and yet she saw the stamp of the same kind of man. "Of course you'll be willing for me to refer to Speke and Burnham?" queried Mr. Spurling. "Yes," she replied, "but I saw little either of Mr. Speke or Mr. Burnham. I was secretary to Mr. Wakeham." And again she flushed painfully. "And you left there on your own accord?" "Yes." "May I ask why?" Eleanor's lips became tremulous, and she spoke with difficulty. "Because Mr. Wakeham was not a gentleman," she replied. Mr. Spurling was silent for a few seconds. Then he said with a smile, "Perhaps both Mr. Speke and Mr. Burnham know more about you than you think. However, I feel quite confident in engaging you if you care to come to me. Yes, there is another question you want to ask me. What is it?" Again Eleanor felt afraid. This old gentleman, pleasant and benign as he appeared to be, seemed to possess a kind of intuition, a power of reading her unexpressed thoughts. "You were wondering how I came to hear of you," he went on, But, my dear young lady, you need not trouble about that. People in my position have all sorts of means of finding out things. Besides, I happen to know the firm you were with before you went to Speke and Burnham's. There's nothing else, is there? Oh, yes, I forgot. There's the question of salary. If it is not rude on my part, how much did they give you?" Eleanor told him. "I will continue that," replied Mr. Spurling, "if it's quite agreeable to you." "Thank you," replied the girl. "And by the way, Miss Trelawney, I have a young lady in the office who has been with me some time. Poor girl, she's very unfortunate. She has just lost her father, and is for the moment without a home. I wonder if you know of lodgings which are within her means. Honeywood is her name. Quite a nice girl." If she would share my rooms," cried Eleanor eagerly. A few minutes later she had explained to Mr. Spurling how she was situated. "Ah, I should think that would suit Miss Honeywood very well. But of course you must see her before anything is settled. Living together is a very serious matter, and you and she might not like each other. I think you will, though. Then there is another matter. I must introduce you to Miss Statham. Miss Statham is my partner's secretary. Indeed, she is something more than a secretary, and has very intimate relationships with the firm. It is well that you should know her. She is a very capable woman, very capable indeed. She has been with us something like 10 years. Will you come this way?" He led the way to an adjoining office as he spoke, an office which was almost a replica of the one she had just left. The same air of comfort prevailed, the same quietness, the same order, and the same atmosphere of established prosperity. Seated at a desk similar to that of Mr. Spurling sat a gentleman who might have been 5 years his junior. He was faultlessly attired, and although not portly like Mr. Spurling, suggested the same quiet contentment. Near to him sat a woman of about 35 years of age, with whom he had evidently been conversing on an important matter. "This is Miss Trelawney, Mr. King, the young lady I told you about. She has been with me for the last hour, and I think we have satisfied each other that we shall be able to work together." "I am delighted, Miss Trelawney," said Mr. King, rising from his chair and holding out his hand. "You'll find Mr. Spurling a hard taskmaster, but I will say this of him, he is very just, extremely so, in fact. This is Miss Statham," and he nodded to the lady who sat near him. "She has been with us a good many years now, and knows our business intimately." "Yes, Miss Trelawney," added Mr. Spurling, "as I told you, it will be well for you to know Miss Statham. She will be able to initiate you into the intricacies of our business better than anyone, and we trust her absolutely, absolutely. We have reason to." Eleanor gave a quick glance towards the woman in question. She was about 35 years of age, but she looked younger, and in a way handsome. 10 years before she might have been beautiful, but now there were lines upon her face, an expression of weariness in her demeanour, and a look in her eyes difficult to define. That she was capable no one could doubt. Proficiency, thoroughness, clear-sightedness, and a keen appreciation of her duties were manifest in her every look and movement. And yet, in a way which Eleanor could not understand, there was something in her presence which repelled her. Perhaps it was because her mouth was somewhat drawn down at the corners, and suggested discontent. Or perhaps it might have been because of something restless and yearning in her eyes. This did not come to Eleanor as a distinct thought, but as a kind of vague impression which she could neither understand nor put into words. And yet she was strangely drawn to her. That the woman was a lady it was impossible to doubt. It might be, too, that she moved in good society, and certainly if her looks did not utterly belie her, she possessed an intelligence of a very high order. "Have you two finished?" asked Mr. Spurling, after a general conversation about the work of the firm. "We were just finishing as you came in," replied Mr. King. "Miss Statham is of opinion that we should take no part in that Indian business, and I quite agree with her." "Ah, you've come to that conclusion too, have you?" replied Mr. Spurling. "Well, I'm very glad of it, but there are 2 or 3 matters I want to speak to you about alone, King, so you may as well come into my room. Meanwhile, I think it will be well for Miss Statham and Miss Trelawney to spend an hour or 2 together." "I was just going to suggest the same thing," replied Mr. King. "Miss Trelawney will naturally feel somewhat strange, and I am sure Miss Statham will soon familiarize her with what she has to do. Then there is the question of Miss Honeywood. Have you spoken to Miss Trelawney?" "I have," replied Mr. Spurling. "Miss Trelawney occupies a little flat quite convenient to her work here, and the young lady who has been living with her has lately left her, so it will be to their mutual advantage to join forces. Assuming, of course, that there is a mutual liking. I think there will be too. Miss Honeywood is not brilliant, but she is an exceedingly nice girl." "It's now 12 o'clock," said Miss Statham, when the partners had left them together. "We will have an hour's chat, and then go out to lunch together. What do you say?" "I shall be delighted," replied Eleanor, who, in spite of Miss Statham's somewhat rigid manner, began to be drawn towards her. For an hour she explained to Eleanor the broad outlines of the business of the firm, and the particular duties she would have to perform, and as one question led to another, Eleanor became impressed by the prodigious amount of knowledge which the other had amassed. As the conversation proceeded, too, the older woman became almost enthusiastic. The firm did business in almost every part of the world, and its transactions were large and important. Eleanor quickly found that Miss Statham's knowledge was not only extensive, but intimate. She was able to explain the locality of shipping centres, of which Eleanor knew nothing but the name. She knew the financial resources of nearly every country in the world, and what those resources comprised. She spoke with assurance of the political outlook, as well as of the constitution of various leading countries, and she seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the markets of the world. "Oh, you are wonderful!" the girl could not help exclaiming after an hour's conversation. "You seem to know everything." "Do I?" replied Miss Statham, with a smile which was a little pathetic. "I had to, you know. The firm, as you can see, has very large connections, and in a way is more or less linked up with nearly all the great commercial nations, and of course I could not occupy a position of trust until I first of all made myself worthy of it. But shall we go and have some lunch now? I happen to know a place where there is a tolerable degree of comfort, and if you don't mind, we'll go there. But let me get off a few things first." She rang a bell as she spoke, and during the next few minutes interviewed 4 grey-haired men, and gave them certain instructions. "There," she said when she had finished, "we can be free for 2 or 3 hours now. When we come back I will introduce you to Miss Honeywood. Poor girl, she is neither handsome nor interesting, and it will be an act of charity on your part to let her live with you." This was Eleanor's introduction to Spurling and King's, and her first impressions were confirmed during the weeks that followed. At first she wondered a good deal why she had been employed by such a firm in such a capacity, with practically no introduction, but as time went by this ceased to trouble her. She devoted all her powers to the understanding of the work she had to do, and did her best to carry out her duties according to her employer's wishes. Indeed, as she told herself again and again, she had been marvellously fortunate. Few girls at her age occupied such an important post. As the weeks went by, and she understood more and more of the inwardness of the work of the firm, her work became increasingly interesting. It is true her salary was not very large, but it was enough for her to live in comfort and to enjoy a moderate amount of amusement. She found Miss Honeywood just as Miss Statham had described her. It is true her intelligence was somewhat limited, while of imagination she had little or none, but she was good-natured and refined. Her parents had been poor, but she had the upbringing of a lady, and thus Eleanor was far more happy in her private life than she had been for some time. Of Wakeham she heard nothing. It might appear that he was glad of her silence. Certainly he took no steps to renew his acquaintance with her. Little by little, too, the poignancy of her memories of the last night she saw him became less and less. She still thought of it with horror and shame, but she tried to drive it away from her mind the moment it came to her. Why it was she could give no definite explanation, but her friendship with Tamsin Cory and the other women of her set cooled as if by magic. She found no delight or interest in Tamsin's society. Indeed, when they occasionally met, she had something like a feeling of shame that she had once called her friend. Of Rod Ravenscroft she had seen nothing since that Sunday morning when he had visited her at St. Hildebrand's Mansions. Neither by word or sign did he remind her of his existence. She remembered with bitterness the circumstances which led to his visit, as well as the conversation which had taken place between them. She tried to cease thinking of him, but could not, and although she struggled against the feeling which possessed her, she knew that it was impossible for her to overcome it. As Eleanor thought of this, she was overwhelmed by a kind of despair. It was true she was comfortably situated. She had an appointment with a good firm, and she was kindly treated, but life, and the whole outlook of life, was utterly barren. She felt that she had thrown away happiness. Even if Rod Ravenscroft had cared for her, he could never be anything to her after what he had seen and heard. She had, by her own madness, destroyed all possibility of his respect. In spite of her utmost endeavour to fight against it, she found herself recalling the scene when Wakeham poured words into her ears which outraged her womanhood. She saw herself struggle with him, saw herself fighting his would-be caresses, leaping out of the taxicab, and rushing madly through the streets of London at midnight. Oh, the horror of it! She remembered the words those drunken men had said to her. They had taken her to be a lost woman of the streets, and had spoken to her as such. And then, while she had fought against them, Rod Ravenscroft had come to her help. What must he have thought of her? Whatever he had felt towards her in the past, he could only think of her now with a kind of shame. And she had brought it on herself. Still, Eleanor Trelawney was a proud girl, and she determined to fight her way. She was interested in her work, too. Her keen intelligence appreciated the far-reaching transactions of Spurling and King, and she saw that although she had been lately employed, she was becoming more and more trusted. The more she saw of Miss Statham, the more she respected her. She could not help doing so. Her almost masculine intelligence and her grasp of the broad issues of commerce compelled her admiration. Socially, however, she drew no nearer to her. Miss Statham gave her no confidences, and asked for none. She met her in a friendly way, talked to her about their work, but beyond this their acquaintance did not go. Eleanor knew nothing of how or where she lived, who her acquaintances were, or what her history was. That she received a good income there could be no doubt. She dressed well, and from what Eleanor could judge, moved in good society. She could not help seeing, too, that she was deeply in the confidence of both her employers, while her opinions were greatly respected and generally acted upon by them. Compared with hers, Eleanor's was a subordinate position. Indeed, she often had to take orders from Miss Statham, as did others who occupied responsible positions in the firm. Thus days lengthened into weeks and weeks into months. Of her home she knew nothing. She had intimated to her father and mother that she did not wish any communication with them, while she had written to her brother John, practically forbidding him to come to see her, and all the time she was filled with a great heart hunger. It was now 10 months since she had left home. The time was not long, as time goes, and yet it seemed to her as though ages had passed since her Hampstead days. She had made her choice in life, but what did it mean? What had the future to offer her? One day, it was just after she had paid her Sunday afternoon visit to Primrose Terrace, Miss Statham came into the room where she was working. "How do you spend your evenings, Miss Trelawney?" she asked. "Generally in my rooms," replied Eleanor. "Occasionally I go to a women's club, of which I am a member, and now and then I take Miss Honeywood to a theatre, and that's about all, I think. I wish you'd come and have some dinner with me on Friday night, will you?" "I shall be awfully glad if I may," replied Eleanor. "Aren't you well, Miss Statham?" "Oh, yes, I'm very well, I suppose, but never mind about me. You will come on Friday night, then?" "Yes, but where?" "I was forgetting. I live close by Regent's Park, about 7 minutes' walk from Oxford Circus subway station. You'd rather come there than go to a restaurant, wouldn't you? Besides, we can be alone and have a quiet chat. Here is my address," and she handed Eleanor a visiting card. On the Friday evening she found her way to the address Miss Statham had given her, and although she could not explain why, she felt that something important was going to happen. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 31. Miss Statham. Eleanor saw at a glance that Miss Statham's rooms had an appearance of comfort, almost amounting to luxury. The house, which was large and handsome, overlooked Regent's Park, and was pleasantly situated. Years before, the whole row in which the house was placed had been occupied by people of position and affluence. As years went by, however, and the craze for flats had grown, this, with other dwellings of a similar nature, had been turned into self-contained suites, and let, much to the proprietor's profit. "Yes, the position is very pleasant," assented Miss Statham, when Eleanor expressed delight at what she saw. "It's very convenient, too. One is in easy access to everything from here, and yet away from the noise and crowds. But come, take off your things, and sit by the fire. We are nearing the end of March, but the weather is bitterly cold." She led the way into her bedroom as she spoke, and Eleanor saw taste and comfort everywhere. "I am glad you like my rooms," said Miss Statham, as she noted Eleanor's look of approbation. "You see, I have a bathroom adjoining, and also another bedroom, in case I want to entertain a friend. From my point of view, I do not suppose I could get anything better. I can be in the office in 20 minutes, and the people here are very good to me. They have a very good cook, and the service is, on the whole, excellent. Sometimes, of course, I dine at a restaurant for a change, but generally I have my dinner served here alone. I see you are looking at my books." she went on, as they entered the front room again. "Yes, I read a good deal. I am not often in the humour for going out, and I'm afraid I am very extravagant in books. Of course, the libraries do one pretty well, but I buy a good many all the same. Somehow I can never enjoy a borrowed book like I can one of my own." A little later they sat down to dinner, which was deftly served by a quick-footed, silent servant. Everything was cooked to perfection, and showed that Miss Statham could command all that money could give her. It was evident, too, that she was a woman of taste. Every piece of furniture was a work of art. Indeed, every article in the room suggested a person of culture and affluence. "And now," said Miss Statham, when they had finished dinner, "draw up your chair to the fire and let us talk. Will you forgive my saying so? I took a liking to you the first time we met, and I have for a long time wanted to ask you to come here, but I kept putting it off. As I get older I am afraid to act on impulse. I want to think out everything again and again before acting." "I expect that is because of the responsible position you hold in the firm," replied Eleanor. "Perhaps so, but I'm inclined to think I am getting crusted. Do you know how old I am?" "A little over 30, I should say." "I am nearly 37." And there was a touch of bitterness in her voice. "Miss Trelawney, I want to tell you that you are winning golden opinions from both Mr. Spurling and Mr. King. I am saying this to spite myself, for I honestly believe I am a little bit jealous of you." Eleanor laughed incredulously. "It's true," replied Miss Statham. "Women are like that. At least women under certain conditions are, and they get jealous in spite of themselves. Do you mind my speaking freely to you?" "I shall be delighted if you will." "Well, I think old maids are nearly all in a state of arrested development. If a woman does not marry by the time she's 35, her nature, instead of mellowing, kind of shrivels up. That's why old maids are sour and vinegary. Would you mind telling me, what are your hopes and prospects?" "That's rather a difficult question. My prospects, you know them better than I. If I please my employers, and business continues good, perhaps I may advance a little more in their confidence. But my hopes? The hopes of a girl are ofttimes very silly, aren't they?" "Are they? I'm not sure. I don't want to depress you, Miss Trelawney, but you asked me the other day whether I was ill. No, I'm not. But I think I am rather miserable." "I'm sorry," replied Eleanor politely. "Some people have a genius for friendship," went on Miss Statham. "I have not. I had years ago, I think, but that part of my nature has become atrophied. But I have taken a liking to you. I feel that I can speak to you. Perhaps there's something akin in our natures. I want to speak confidentially to you about myself. It's an awful confession to make, isn't it? But I do. Is it because I'm getting old, or is it a woman's whim? I am 37, and you are just over 20, I suppose?" "Nearly 22," replied Eleanor. "Then there are 15 years between us. Do you ever expect to get married?" "No," replied Eleanor. "But you will. At least, I hope you will." "Why should I?" Miss Statham was silent for a few seconds. "Miss Trelawney," she said at length, "I suppose I am what you might call a well-educated woman. My father was a barrister, and sufficiently successful to be able to send me to a good school, St. Andrew's, in fact. When I finished there, I went on to Girton, and was supposed to distinguish myself. You have some idea of what Girton is, and how a number of girls will talk when they get together. I got mixed up with what was called the advanced set, and we discussed in our own way what a woman's life ought to be. We greatly believed in woman's rights, and we scorned the idea that a woman should in any way live a life inferior to that of a man. Of course, we were angry that we could not take our degrees in the same way men could, however much we might be superior to them in intelligence and attainments. We claimed that no position should be open to a man which was not also open to a woman. In the abstract, I suppose we were right. Anyhow, my mind was filled with all that sort of thoughts. A number of us laughed at marriage. We scorned the idea that any woman should give herself to a man. Indeed, there were many who declared that marriage was a defunct institution, and that while it might be necessary in a condition of serfdom, it was an outrage in these days of intellectual advancement. You understand the sort of thing I am referring to. I suppose I was among the most advanced of our little coterie. I scorned the idea of falling in love, and laughed at marriage." She hesitated a little while, and then said with a nervous laugh, "I'm afraid I'm boring you, aren't I?" "Oh, no," cried Eleanor. "I'm deeply interested." "When I was 22," went on Miss Statham, "a man proposed to me." "Did you like him?" asked Eleanor, as Miss Statham again hesitated. "I suppose I did. Yes, I'm sure I did. He was a nice fellow. He took his degree in the year I was a fresher, and went to the bar. He was not brilliant, just a plodding, hard-working fellow, but he was a gentleman, and I liked him. But I refused him. I calculated the sort of life I should have to live. I knew he would never be a great man. He would earn a few hundreds a year, perhaps 1,000 or 2, if he were fortunate, but nothing more." "And you refused him?" "Yes, I refused him. I asked myself about the future. Why should I be tied to a man who would take me to live in some little suburban villa where I should have to be a household drudge and the mother of squalling babies? I wanted liberty. I wanted to travel. I wanted to have a career. I wanted to be free from the responsibilities of home life. And, as I said, I refused him. I had professed to scorn the idea of love, and I had accepted what we called our advanced thinking very eagerly." "Yes, and then?" asked Eleanor with wide open eyes. "My mother died when I was about 12, went on Miss Statham, "and just after Harry Prideaux proposed to me, my father died. He was not in the front rank of successful men, but he left me just over 200 a year, enough to support me. I felt awfully lonely, but I would not lower the flag of the set with which I had become associated, for we had formed a kind of cult. I had dreamed of taking up some public work, of distinguishing myself by being in the vanguard of some advanced movement. So I settled down to work. I wrote a novel, a kind of problem novel, the thing that was fashionable 15 years ago. It was not a great success, although it brought me a number of complimentary reviews. Then for a time I edited a weekly paper, the New Woman kind of thing. It died in a few months. Presently Mr. King, who had been a friend of my father's, offered me a post in his firm, and being at a loose end at the moment, I took it. I suppose I had some aptitude for business, for I was able to please both members of the firm, and got more and more trusted. It's not much of a story, is it?" And she laughed a little bitterly. "It is very interesting," affirmed Eleanor. "Of course, I had other offers of marriage," went on Miss Statham, "but I did not regard them seriously. What love I had been given to Harry Prideaux, and I had refused him." A silence fell between the two women, a silence which was almost painful. Presently, however, Miss Statham burst out almost angrily. "Why have I told you this? I'm a middle-aged woman now. In 3 years I shall be 40, with my youth and whatever beauty I had, all gone, while you are a young girl just over 20. Why should I bore you?" "But you are not boring me," cried Eleanor. Miss Statham started to her feet, walked to a window, pulled aside the curtain, and looked out into the night. Then she came back. "Miss Trelawney," she said, "I am telling you this because I have been a fool. Oh, such a fool!" Eleanor was silent. She did not know what to say. "Yes, I suppose I have been a successful woman," went on Miss Statham. "I have a position of trust and responsibility. I earn a big income. In a way, I am interested, deeply interested, in the enterprises of the firm. There's nothing sordid about them. They touch the big things of life. They bring me into contact with people who occupy high places. I have a great deal of liberty, too. Sometimes I travel. More than once the partners have commissioned me to go abroad and deal with big things. For 2 months in the year I can do pretty much as I like, and during the past few years I have gone to the most interesting places in the world. I am a member of the best woman's club in London, and having the advantage of a good name, and being what is called well connected, I am invited to all sorts of good houses. As you see, I have surrounded myself with pretty things. I can afford to do so. Mr. Spurling and Mr. King, who in spite of their old-fashioned ideas are both broad-minded men, pay me just as they would pay a man in my position, and if I wanted more money I could have it. I live, as you see, in comfort. I have no need to trouble about money at all. And yet, Miss Trelawney, I am not happy, and I have been a fool." "Why? How?" asked the girl. "Because I would give it all up, gladly give it up to be in that suburban villa I used to scorn, the drudge of a man, the mother of squalling youngsters. I would give anything now to see little children coming into a room, putting their arms round my neck and calling me mother. I would give years of my life to be the house-frau that I used to despise." "But think of your position, your freedom," persisted Eleanor. "Position, freedom," cried Miss Statham. "What is it worth? What are my prospects? What have I to look forward to? I'm 37. In a few more years I shall want to retire. Well, I shall be able to do so in comfort. But what then? What are the prospects of a loveless old maid? What lies at the end of it all? What is the value of all this silly jargon about careers for women? Mind, in a way it's all right. I fully believe that careers should be open to women, and there are some women who are obliged to live single lives. But speaking for myself, I have played a fool. I have realized through the years that I did love Harry Prideaux. Oh, yes, he's still alive. He's married for that matter, and I suppose has difficulty in making both ends meet. But he is happy. His children are growing up around him. He has all the amenities of home life. And his wife, I met her some time ago. Her dress was a little shabby, but I knew by the light in her eyes that she possessed the secret of which I knew nothing. Why did you leave home, Miss Trelawney?" The question came out like a pistol shot. "Because, I wanted to be free," replied Eleanor. "Because I had contracted all sorts of ideas during the war, and I hated the restrictions of home life. You know how things have been these last few years." "I met your father some time ago," said Miss Statham. "One of the most delightful men I think I ever saw." Eleanor was silent. "I imagine that he was somewhat of a stickler for old-time views, though," and Miss Statham watched her companion closely as she spoke. "Yes," replied Eleanor. "You see, he had been away from home for several years, and while he was away, new ideas came to the front. Conventions are broken down. The custom of a girl having a chaperone when she goes to a dance is laughed at. Girls demand latch keys, and resent being questioned as to where they have been and what they've been doing. And I suppose when your father came home he insisted on home discipline." "I suppose in his way he was very kind," said Eleanor slowly, "but he would have obedience. He forbade certain of my friends to come to the house. He would not consent to my going to a dance, except in accordance with his ideas. He protested against girls going out to supper with men after theatres. But, oh, you know the sort of thing." "So you left home?" "Yes, I left home." "And what is it all worth?" "What do you mean?" "I mean your so-called liberty, Miss Trelawney. Isn't home life, the comforts and the refinements and the love of home life, 1,000 times more than what you have got?" "Have you heard anything about me?" asked Eleanor. "Not much, but Mr. Spurling told me you had left home, and that you had asked him not to write to your father. It was easy to guess the rest. I can see the kind of girl you are. But, Miss Trelawney, when you have said all that can be said about the higher education of women, and careers for women, and all that sort of thing, the true career for a woman is to be married to a good man, to have the cares of a home, and to become the mother of children. There is nothing higher, nothing holier, in all the wide world. Oh, if only I had a home, and brothers and sisters, and children! I tell you, it's not only insanity, but rank blasphemy to talk as some do about marriage. I have heard women talk about their right to have children without marriage ties. All that sort of thing was born in hell. I've thought about it all, heard all the arguments about it, and I tell you, marriage is a sacred thing, and if ever it is destroyed, the best things in life will be destroyed. Oh God, what fools we women are, especially those of us who are called intellectual. Have you any religion, Miss Trelawney?" Eleanor made no reply. "It's all part of the same thing. We women think we know better than God, think we can do without God, and all the rest follows. After all, the happiest people in the world, and the most useful people in the world, are those who find new avenues of usefulness along old paths." For hours they talked, the woman of 37 and the girl of 22. No further reference was made to Eleanor's leaving home, yet every word the other spoke made Eleanor realize the inwardness of what she had done, and presently, when she made her way back to St. Hildebrand's Mansions, she was in a very thoughtful mood. The next day Peggy came to see her, and after taking her to the theatre, the two girls had returned to Eleanor's rooms and had talked long and earnestly together. She did not tell Peggy a word about her visit to Miss Statham. In fact, she had been extremely reticent about her own thoughts and feelings. Nevertheless, after she had gone, and she found herself alone, she sat for a long time thinking hard and wonderingly. When Miss Honeywood came back, she wondered at Eleanor's silence, wondered, too, at the strange look in her eyes. "What are you doing to-day, Miss Trelawney?" asked Miss Honeywood on the Sunday morning. "Nothing in particular," replied Eleanor. "Why?" "My cousins have asked me to go and stay with them at their house in Enfield, and I thought you might like to come with me. They have often asked me to bring you to see them." "It's awfully good of them," Eleanor made answer, "but not to-day, thank you. I don't feel in the humour for seeing people. I think I want to be alone." When Miss Honeywood left, however, the girl found herself in a very unsettled frame of mind. Miss Statham's words haunted her. Of what use, after all, was the freedom she had gained? It was not as though she had no home, and was obliged to live as she was doing. Had that been the case, she thought she could have been tolerably content. But in spite of everything, the thought of home made a strong appeal to her. She could not help remembering what Miss Statham had said about her father. Yes, in a way she was proud of him. He might be a little puritanical, but he was a gentleman still, a gentleman of the highest order. He was lovable, too. In her antagonism to his restrictions, she had declared she had not a particle of affection for him, but as she sat thinking about him that morning, something seemed to rise up in her heart, something which she could not understand. Not that she intended to go back. Her pride, if nothing else, forbade that. She could not conceive herself confessing that she had made a mistake. And yet, where was Rod Ravenscroft, she wondered. Since that morning after the awful night which she still shuddered to think about, she had never seen him, never heard of him. Of course he had forgotten her. Probably he had become engaged to that girl she had seen him with on Hampstead Heath, or if not her, another. Oh, what a fool, what a blind fool she had been. Her heart ached at the thought of living her life without him, and yet she would have to. Suppose she should succeed even as Miss Statham had succeeded, and suppose she were to receive a salary sufficient to enable her to live amid such surroundings as Miss Statham lived, what then? Then the other side rose up before her. After all, marriage was a sordid, miserable thing, and men in the main were brutes. Peggy had married the man she said she loved. Yet think of her spending her life with such a creature as Barnes. Think of the intimate associations which a wife must have with such a husband. The thought was nauseous. And all men were essentially the same, mean, selfish, mere animals who looked upon women as their playthings. No, on the whole she was glad of what she had done. She, Eleanor Trelawney, could never become the orthodox wife. She could never submit to a lifetime association with any man, even although her heart were at that moment aching for Rod Ravenscroft. She took a book from a shelf and tried to read, but the thing would not hold her attention. She found her mind wandering. What was Peggy doing, she wondered? The child's misery had saddened her, and she instinctively felt how Peggy loathed the thought of going back to Primrose Terrace. She herself became heavy-hearted and miserable at the thought of it. She threw aside the book. She could not stay indoors. But where could she go? The day was a wild and stormy one, and the dark clouds which had swept across the sky were in accord with her feelings. Yet she felt anxious about Peggy. Somehow or another she was possessed with the idea that all was not right, that something more than ordinary had happened. She remembered, half with a laugh of amusement and half with a feeling of disgust, her experiences at Primrose Terrace, and she could not think of going there again. All the same, when afternoon came she made her way towards the tube that would take her to Camden Town. Yes, she felt she must go. She wanted to assure herself that no harm had happened to her sister. A little later she stood at the door of 13 Primrose Terrace and knocked. There was no reply. She knocked again and again. Still there was no answer. The house was empty. What could it mean? She was about to turn away when the door of the adjoining house was opened. "You want to see Mrs. Barnes?" asked a slatternly woman. "I want to see young Mrs. Barnes, yes." "Well, she ain't here. Mrs. Barnes and the girls are gone away for a bit of an holiday. Where Jim Barnes is, I don't know. Are you the sister of the young lady what married Jim Barnes?" "Yes." "Well, then you can't see her," and the woman laughed meaningly. "I don't understand," said Eleanor. "Is there anything wrong?" "It's not for me to say nothink, although I am a next door neighbour, but perhaps I ought to tell you. Young Mrs. Barnes went out yesterday about 1:30, and no sooner had she gone than Mrs. Barnes and the girls left the 'ouse. Mrs. Barnes says to me, 'Mrs. Simpkins,' she says, 'me and the girls are going off for a bit of an holiday, and we shan't be back for a few days, while Jim is off on his own. If that young minx of a wife of his comes here knocking, as I expect she will, you can give her this letter. It will give her full explanation,' she says." But what do you mean?" asked Eleanor. "I'm telling you as fast as I can. I went out to the movies last night, went out about 8, and didn't come back until after 10. I hadn't been back long when I heard the knocker of number 13 going like anythink, so I just opened the door, and there was your sister. It would seem that she didn't know anythink about Mrs. Barnes and the girls going away, for when I told her, she seemed all stunned like. I guv her the note which Mrs. Barnes had left, and that's all. At least that's all I know for certain, although I've me thoughts. I ain't lived here for nothink. Mrs. Barnes have told me a lot, she have. More than once she says to me, 'Jim's wife may be a lady,' she says, 'and have a lot of aristocratic connections,' she says, 'but she don't bring a penny with her, and Jim ain't going to stand her tantrums.' When she came here first, Mrs. Barnes kind of crowed over me, and made out that she was superior to me, and was going to be invited to the General's house and all that sort of thing. But I told her what I thought then, I did, and when I sees how things were going on, and heard what the girls said, I was able to put 2 and 2 together, I was." "But you gave my sister a note." "Yes, I give it to her just as it was guv to me. I'm a respectable woman, I am, and didn't open it, nor nothink." "And she? What did she say?" "She didn't say nothink. She seemed all stunned like, and as she had never been friendly with me, I just closed the door as soon as I gave her the letter." "Is that all you know?" asked Eleanor. "Well, it is and it isn't. Just out of curiosity like, I opened the door again and watched her, and I see her go down the steps and walk away by herself. She didn't seem to know where she was going or what she was doing. Then I see her stand under that lamp post and read the letter I guv her. I watched her for 2 or 3 minutes while she stood there, and then she kind of staggered away." "And is that all you know?" "That's all I know. It wasn't my business, and she never even condescended to speak to me, so why should I trouble? But I have me thoughts all the same." Eleanor left Primrose Terrace almost frenzied with anxiety. She had heard enough to tell her the whole miserable story. What had happened was evident, but what had become of Peggy? Where had she gone? She had a few shillings in her pocket, she knew. She had given her some money herself. But where had she gone? What had she done? If the Barnes' door was closed against her, where could she go? Where had she passed the night? The thought of Peggy wandering through the miserable streets of Camden Town late at night, homeless and friendless, was horrible to contemplate, and yet that was what must have happened to her. Almost unconsciously she made her way back to St. Hildebrand's Mansions. She wanted to be alone. She wanted to think out the whole situation. The thought was maddening. Peggy, her sister, to be placed in such an awful predicament. She, a young girl, to be homeless, friendless, deserted. She thought she saw the reason why Peggy had not come to her. She was too proud, too ashamed to confess the ghastly truth. She dismissed the thought that Peggy had gone home to Hampstead with scarcely a moment's consideration. She remembered that her sister had said only the previous night that she could never go home again. But where was she? That was the thought which haunted her with ghastly persistency. She made herself a cup of tea, and then, having hurriedly swallowed it, went out again. The room seemed to stifle her. Presently she found herself in Holborn. Sunday evening though it was, buses rushed thither and thither, while pedestrians thronged the sidewalks. Unheeding whither she went, she turned her face eastward, and presently found herself in the city. She had no reason for going there. She simply followed a blind impulse. The traffic was much thinner here, and she was able to think more calmly. As she walked, the church bells began to ring. They were calling the people to worship. She had told herself again and again that that kind of thing had no meaning to her, that it had gone with 100 other effete institutions, and yet these church bells had a meaning. All over the land they would be ringing, calling the people to prayer. There was something beautiful in the thought, in spite of everything. Why should one pray? And why was it that what people called religion still appealed to people, when intellectually they had given up the creeds of their fathers? Of course, too, religion was associated with some ethical code, and after all, the best and the most thoughtful people in the world had declared their need of it. She, Eleanor Trelawney, was a living being with all sorts of hopes and longings and desires. What was life after all? What did it mean? Was there anything after death? Of what she saw and heard during her walk back to St. Hildebrand's Mansions, she knew nothing, cared nothing. When she saw the great block of buildings, of which her little rooms formed a tiny part, she almost shuddered. It might be hours before Miss Honeywood would return. How could she bear to pass the time alone? She entered the vestibule with a heartache such as she thought she had never felt before, and then suddenly she started back like one afraid. The place was dimly lit, and the man who attended the lift did not appear to be near, but she had a kind of consciousness that she was being watched. "Eleanor, it is you, isn't it?" It was Peggy's voice. "Peggy!" The word was a gasp. Is it you?" "Yes, can't you see?" Then the floodgates of Eleanor's heart were opened, and throwing her arms round her sister's neck, she sobbed convulsively. "Oh, thank God! Thank God!" she cried, but why she said it she did not know. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 32. Peggy pleads with Eleanor. They were seated alone in Eleanor's room. Peggy had thrown off her hat and jacket, while Eleanor looked at her again and again, as if to assure herself that it was really her sister. Perhaps she had not yet recovered from the experiences of the day, but she could not understand the look in Peggy's eyes. She had feared that some awful calamity had befallen her. Even now she was afraid of the revelations which might be made to her. That was why she wondered at the look of joy which she saw. "Peggy, tell me," she cried. "I don't know why it was, but I went up to that awful place to see you this afternoon, and the door was locked, and the woman in the next house told me such a horrible story. Tell me, where have you been? What has happened? What is the meaning of it all?" "Don't you know?" cried Peggy. "But of course you don't. How could you? I forgot." And then the child poured out the miserable story of the past few months, told of the things about which she had, in the past, been silent, showed her sister her heart. "I didn't know anything could be so horrible," she sobbed. "Oh, I was mad. I did not understand. I did not realize. But I had not been married to him long before I saw what he was, knew what it was to be the wife of such. You don't know, Eleanor. You can't think. But still I fought on. I would not give in. I would not confess that I had made a mistake. I said I would be loyal to him, and all the time, oh, I can't tell you. You know what it was like on that Sunday afternoon, the kind of house, the kind of people. When I got back last night, the place was empty, and that horrid woman told me that Mrs. Barnes and her daughters had gone away, and then she gave me a letter. Here it is. Read it." "And you know no more than this?" asked Eleanor after she had read. The child shook her head. "But what did you do? How did you spend the night? Why didn't you come back here?" "I didn't know what to do. I think I was mad. I remember wandering round the streets, not knowing where I was going. If I thought anything at all, it was that I would find my way to the river and throw myself in. I did not feel as though I could come to you, somehow. I didn't think you would understand, but I kept on walking, and then suddenly I found myself on Hampstead Heath, and "Yes?" cried Eleanor eagerly. "I don't know how it was, but I heard myself saying, 'I will arise and go to my father,' and I found myself at home, and there was a light in the window, and I rushed to the door, and Dad came out and brought me in. Oh, Eleanor, Eleanor!" "Then you went home?" "I couldn't help it. Do you know what he said to me when he came that morning I told you about? 'The door will be always open to you, Peg,' and his words have remained in my memory ever since." "And they received you kindly?" "Oh, Eleanor, you don't know. You can't think how good Dad is, or how beautiful he was. Of course, in a way, I expected that Mother would. But, oh, Dad was just lovely. He took me on his knee, just as he did years ago, and I found myself with my arms round his neck, telling him everything." For a moment a feeling of anger shot into Eleanor's heart. A sense of pride rose up within her, a horror of failure. "Then you swallowed your pride?" she found herself saying. "Eleanor, what pride had I? What had I to be proud about? Why, as you know, I had been a bad, wicked girl. We both had. And I could not help going home. Oh, if you knew how splendid Dad is! Why, in spite of everything, I went to sleep feeling happy. Just the knowledge that I was in my own bed again, and that I was home, and do you know when Dad came into the room and knelt down by me and said, 'God bless you, my little Peg,' I felt as though, oh, I can't tell you what I felt. It's all been so horrible, and I've been so wicked. But I'm glad I went home." "Then you've gone home to stay?" "Where else could I go? Besides, after all that common, tawdry, shabby vulgarity, to find myself at home, where things were beautiful and pure and clean, it was just heaven. I don't know how it was, but last night when I read that letter, something seemed to break, and I saw things as they really were. Oh, how could I have done it, Eleanor?" "And you've come from home now?" said her sister, bewildered at what had taken place, and hardly understanding Peggy's incoherent story. "Yes. the child replied. "And do you know, I did not wake until midday today, and it was all so beautiful. And then Trev came home, quite unexpectedly. He isn't going back to Ireland again, and of course it was all so wonderful. You see, Trev's so changed. And then he insisted on bringing Mary Penryn, that's the girl he's engaged to, and I think I forgot everything except my own happiness. All those horrible months seemed as though they never existed, and they were all so good to me, Eleanor. Mary Penryn is just lovely. No wonder Trev's fond of her. No one upbraided me, and they've been so kind. Oh, it has all been so wonderful, so horrible, and yet so beautiful. I hardly know what I'm saying. Then Trev mentioned your name, and immediately I felt I must come and tell you. Dad wanted to come with me, but I wouldn't let him. Then John insisted that he would come, but I felt as though it wouldn't be right somehow. I wanted to see you myself, and I told them that I would come alone. And when I got here you were gone, but I wouldn't go away. I knew you would be home sometime, so I said I'd wait, and I have waited, you see. I could not help coming for you, dear." "Coming for me?" "Yes, coming for you, for of course you're coming back with me." Eleanor shook her head. "No," she replied, "I can't do that." "But why? They are waiting for you." "How do you know? Did they tell you anything? Oh, you really must come home with me. You must." "And confess myself a failure? No, I won't." "You can't mean that." "Yes, I do." The girl spoke defiantly. "Now I know you are safe, I shall be all right. Perhaps it was right for you to go home. You are different, but I cannot do it." In vain Peggy pleaded with her. Eleanor longed to do what her sister asked. Her heart ached for a sight of her father and mother, but something forbade her. Her pride rose in revolt. She could not go back and confess she had been wrong, for she knew she had been wrong. But to go back and confess it was too humiliating. "Then I suppose I must go without you," said Peggy sadly, "or they will be thinking that something has happened to me, and I did hope you'd come with me." At that moment there was a knock at the door, and a man who was employed by the owner of the flat appeared. "A telephone message for you, miss." "Yes, what is it?" "It's from Miss Honeywood, miss. She phoned to say that her friends at Enfield wanted her to stay the night, and thinking you wouldn't mind, she consented. That's all, miss." "There now," cried Peggy when the man had gone. "You can't stay here after that. Oh, Eleanor, why be lonely and miserable?" "I am not lonely, and I am not miserable," replied the girl. "I have my work to do, and I am going to live my own life. Do you know, Peg, I have got a splendid position, and I shall have all sorts of opportunities for advancement. But it's no use talking. I'm not going back." Peggy made her way to the door. "Good night, dear. Is there any message you would like me to give them at home?" Eleanor shook her head. "Shall I ask Trev to bring Mary Penryn here? I know you'd like her." Again she shook her head. "There's nothing you'd like me to say to Dad and Mother, is there?" "No." "Then good night." There was something pathetic in the child's tone, something which appealed to Eleanor strongly. A great weight had been lifted from her heart to know that Peggy was safe, and yet as she realized that her sister's life had been ruined, that the past few months had meant, and must ever mean, an irreparable tragedy in her life, she felt a horrible remorse. It was her fault. Peggy had been greatly under her influence, and had she acted differently, her sister's life might have been saved. But because she had been under the spell of such women as Thames and Corey, and had listened to her unhealthy talk, She had allowed Peggy to go her own way, and this was the result of it. Still, she steeled her heart against her sister's pleading. She could not, no, she simply could not go back to her home after all that had taken place. She opened the door, and Peggy passed out on to the landing. As she did so, a sense of utter desolation swept over her. Peggy would go home, while she would be left there in loneliness. After all, what had she to stay away for? What had she gained by going away? And was not Peggy right? Hadn't she too been a bad girl? Her heart ached with a great hunger. She longed for the life she had forsaken, longed with an unutterable longing. Why should she stay there in loneliness and misery? Besides, it was her duty to go home. At that moment she realized something of what her father and mother must have felt because of her action. Perhaps they had spent sleepless nights thinking about her and Peggy, and she had been careless, indifferent about them. She had thought only of herself, nothing of her duty. "Honour thy father and thy mother." The words came to her mind. All the influences of her early years were at work. Oh, those things which she had learnt when her mother taught her to say her simple prayers. Her innermost soul was calling out for something which she had discarded, forgotten, and yet which was the great secret of life. It all came like a flash, and although it has taken me some time even to suggest her feelings, Peggy had scarcely passed from the door before the truth came to her. "Peggy!" she called, and the word was like a gasp. "Yes, dear, what is it?" I'll go with you. Wait, no, don't say anything. I can't bear it. But wait." Almost feverishly she put on her hat and jacket, and they left St. Hildebrand's Mansions and went into the street. "Dad told me," began Peggy. No, don't speak," interrupted Eleanor. There's a taxi." Almost frantically she stopped the driver, who drew up at the curb. Neither of the two girls spoke a word as the taxi made its way towards Hampstead, but Peggy, who had nestled close to her sister's side, sobbed quietly. As for Eleanor, she sat perfectly still, gazing with unseeing eyes into the streets. The taxi had barely reached the door of General Trelawney's house when it opened. It might seem as though someone were waiting, listening. "Hello, Peg, you've got back. Splendid!" It was the General's voice. "And you too, Eleanor. Splendid! Run in, will you? I'll pay the man." A minute later the General entered the house and saw Eleanor standing in the hall alone. He was an understanding man, and knew that what might appeal to Peggy, and for that matter was absolutely necessary to her, would be repugnant to his other girl. The two were entirely different. Peggy was impulsive, emotional, easily moved, quick to manifest her feelings. Eleanor, on the other hand, was outwardly cold. She dreaded scenes. She was not given to evidence her feelings. For a few seconds the two stood looking at each other, as if trying to read the other's thoughts. The father saw that his eldest daughter's eyes were hard and defiant, even while they were yearning, saw that she was fighting a great battle, and that a wrong word on his part might do infinite harm. "Eleanor, my dear," he said, "I am glad to see you. This is simply splendid. You have just come in time for supper, too." Not a word of reproach, not a suggestion that she had come back as a disobedient child, only a glad welcome, just as though she had been away for a long holiday and had returned. She did not speak. She could not, but she seemed to be waiting for something. What? Neither of them could have told. Then the General, scarcely knowing what he was doing, held out his arms, and the girl, almost as unconsciously, threw herself into them. "Dad," she said, "it's awfully hard for you, but will you forgive me?" "There, there," cried the father. "It's beautiful to see you home again, my dear. Ah, Alice, there you are. Eleanor's come just in time for supper." It was all so natural, yet so wonderful. Instinctively she knew what her father felt, knew of the thoughts which were surging through his mind at that moment, realized the nightmare of the last few months, and yet he never hinted at it. He seemed to know by some wonderful wizardry what her feelings were, knew that she could not bear the words which might seem natural under the circumstances, and because she understood, she felt as though a great healing power had passed over her. It was as though the thought of his love, although she felt more than ever her own wrongdoing, brought joy instead of reproach in her homecoming. Yes, Peggy was right. Her father was wonderful, and she knew, as she had never known before, what a daughter's love meant. Somehow the crust which had encased her heart was broken, and the cold pride in which she had rather gloried was melted. How it was she could not tell, but Eleanor felt like a new girl. For the first time in years she wanted some manifestation of affection, wanted to hear words of tenderness. "But, Dad," she said, "you'll try to forgive me, won't you? And, oh, I do love you." There was a catch in her voice as she spoke, and the General felt the tears well into his eyes. "But not as much as I love you, dear, not half. But there, it's splendid to have you home." A few minutes later Eleanor had recovered herself. She wondered how she could have so given way to her feelings, but she was not a bit ashamed of them. Some strange alchemy had been at work that had changed everything. Then there was Eleanor's meeting with her brothers and Mary Penryn. Everything passed off in the most ordinary way. It might seem as though everything had been arranged beforehand, and the General had told his children what they were and were not to say. But this was not so. He simply knew how to lead the conversation into right channels, knew by a kind of instinct and intuition what words ought to be said. Nevertheless, the joy of it all was beyond words. Instinctively the General's mind swept back to that first Sunday night after those long years of absence, and he realized what that night had meant in their lives, realized the antagonism which existed, and how it had embittered the whole of the succeeding months, and must throw a dark shadow upon the future of all of them. But he said no word about it. Words would be worse than useless at such a time. What he felt may be guessed, but cannot be described. "For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful," repeated the General as they sat down to supper. Old-time words, repeated oft-times without meaning, yet somehow each felt them to be something more than a mere matter of form as they passed his lips. The whole atmosphere of the place was that of thanksgiving and quiet joy. "What do you think of Mary?" asked Trev, who sat next to her at the supper table. "Isn't she fine? I tell you I'm the luckiest beggar in the world. I shall be able to see her nearly every day now. You do like Mary, don't you?" "Of course I do, Trev. She's a dear sweet girl." "I knew you'd say so," cried Trev with all the fervour of a young lover. "I can't get over it, you know." "Get over what?" "What she should see in me. And do you know, things are turning out splendidly too. I was made captain during the war, and then afterwards I went down the scale and had to be contented with being lieutenant, but they are putting me back again." "Back again? What do you mean?" I'm captain permanently now. Mary's mightily pleased, I can tell you. And as for her father, you must meet the squire. He's just the bluff old chap that one reads about in stories. But he's nothing to Dad. Isn't Dad great? Do you know, when I first saw him, I was awfully proud of him, but I know," replied Eleanor. Oh, how beautiful it was to be among her own people again, to breathe the atmosphere of refinement and understanding. She had felt afraid. All sorts of forebodings had filled her mind. More than once on her way to the house she was on the point of telling the driver to stop. But her father had made the difficult places easy. With his old-fashioned courtesy and his wonderful knowledge, he had made everything so easy for her. She did not deserve it. She knew she did not deserve it. And while his kindness made her past disobedience harder for her to bear, she felt thankful for it. There were only 2 awkward situations during the whole evening. One was when the clock was striking 10, and she had declared that she must go back to St. Hildebrand's Mansions. "Back to that place, my dear? But why?" asked the General. "Isn't your room ready? Alice, isn't Eleanor's room ready?" "Certainly it is." "Then of course you'll not go back," said the General, as though he took the matter for granted. "But I must get to business to-morrow morning," she urged. "Then go to business from here, my dear." He took her position at Spurling and King's as a matter of course, and whatever he may have felt about it, he offered no opinion. "Do you really want me to stay, Dad?" And she spoke to him in a husky voice. "Want you to stay? Why, Eleanor!" That was all, but it was enough. And Eleanor, although she felt everything differently from Peggy, realized that she was at home, and that the old foolish, wicked past was as if it had never taken place. The other awkward situation was when, shortly after 10 o'clock, Rod Ravenscroft was ushered into the room where the family were sitting. Eleanor had expected nothing of the sort, and so when, without warning of any sort, he stood before her, she felt as though she could not speak. Ravenscroft, who had not seen her at first, spoke to Mrs. Trelawney, then to the General, after which his eyes swept quickly round the room. Seeing Peggy, he moved towards her. But no sooner did he catch sight of Eleanor than he stood still, as if not knowing what to do. For a moment an awkward silence prevailed, but the General, with that keen intuition which made him understand what ought to be done, spoke as naturally as if nothing had taken place. "Yes, we're all glad to see you, Rod," he cried. "It's the first time we have all met together since I left home years ago. Isn't it lucky that Treb should be able to come home and find Eleanor and Peg here? I think you have met Miss Penryn. Yes, I see you have. A good job for you that you approve of his engagement. If you hadn't, there would have been pistols for 2 and coffee for 1 to-morrow morning. Ah, Trev is a lucky young beggar. Splendid, isn't it?" This speech of the General's gave the 2 girls time to recover themselves, and enabled Ravenscroft to act naturally. For the next hour, laughter and good feeling abounded. Both the General and Mrs. Trelawney seemed to be as light-hearted as children, while from John's eyes a light shone which told how happy he was. "By the way, John," said Ravenscroft, "I really called in about that patent of yours. It's all right. Nothing like it has been placed on the market, and the patent is as sound as a bell." "Splendid," laughed the General. "What a good thing it is to have a friend who is a lawyer, and especially as he happens to be specializing in patent acts." "It's going to be a great thing, General," said Ravenscroft. "Anyone to look at John wouldn't think he's got it in him, would they?" At this there was general laughter, especially as the boy looked shy and confused. "No use blushing, John," cried the General. "You can't keep it a secret any longer. The engineering world will soon be shaken to its foundations, while motorists everywhere will be talking of Trelawney's non-gear changing invention." "Yes, John's going to be a millionaire," laughed Ravenscroft. "On every hand there will be a demand for the thing, and he's going to have a royalty on every one that's sold. No, John, old chap, I'm not going to tell you how much. Somebody will be telling secrets to the income tax people. Think of John having to pay super tax. You'll have to get married, old chap. I hear there's going to be a big percentage taken off in the case of married men." "Also reduction for each child," shouted Trev. "Look here, John, it isn't fair, old man. Here shall I be, a poor soldier with a captain's pay, while you will be rolling in riches." "And where will the poor barrister come in?" asked Ravenscroft. "No need to trouble about lawyers," retorted John quietly. "They always manage to annex a big share of the booty." But although no apparent notice was taken of the return of Eleanor and Peg, the influence of that return was felt by everyone, and Ravenscroft, who did not know of all the circumstances, found himself wondering as to the meaning of what had taken place. Presently, however, just as he was leaving, he had an opportunity to be with Eleanor alone. "I want to see you very much," he said. "To see you alone. May I?" "I am at business all through the day," she managed to reply. "Are you going to retain your post?" he stammered. "Certainly," was her reply. "But you leave Spurling and King's at 5:30. You'll be free after that time." "How do you know?" "Never mind that. I know you will be. Shall I find you here tomorrow at 6:30? "Perhaps," and her reply was almost a whisper. "Oh, Eleanor," cried Peggy, as the two girls sat alone in the latter's room later, if I'd only known." Her sister was silent. "In a way I'm so happy," sobbed the child, "and yet it's all so ghastly." Still Eleanor did not reply. She knew what was in the other's heart. "To think that I ever became the wife of that man! To think that Oh, Eleanor, I can't bear it. And I've my life all before me, too. Isn't there some way out of it, I wonder?" "If there is, Dad will find it," was Eleanor's reply. "Yes," cried Peggy. "There's always Dad, isn't there? And if he only could, if he only could." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 33. Love Wins Out. Rod Ravenscroft had hurried to Duloe immediately after his day's work was over, and found his heart beating wildly as he was ushered into an empty room. "General Trelawney is not yet home, sir," the servant told him. "Neither is Mr. John. Mrs. Trelawney has gone out for a ride with Captain Trelawney and Miss Peggy." "But Miss Trelawney is at home, isn't she?" he asked. "Yes, sir, she came in a few minutes ago." "Will you ask her whether she will see me?" The servant left the room with a meaning smile on her lips. Perhaps she guessed what was in the young fellow's heart. When Eleanor entered the room he saw that her face was very pale, and that her eyes had a cold, unnatural look. For a few seconds they regarded each other in silence. It seemed as though neither was able to speak. "I couldn't help coming," Ravenscroft managed to say at length. I wanted to tell you how glad I am, for you have come home for good now, haven't you?" "I don't know," replied Eleanor. "But of course you have, and I'm so glad." "But why should you be?" she asked coldly. She had difficulty in restraining her feelings. Her nerves seemed raw. Her whole being was wrought up to an unnatural pitch. Surely you know," was his response. "I'm afraid you give me credit for more knowledge than I possess," was her response. "But I forgot. I want to congratulate you on your engagement." "On my engagement? What engagement?" "I was informed today that you were engaged to Miss Ongar, the only daughter of Mr. Fleming Ongar, K.C., the famous barrister. Did I see you with her on the Heath here some time ago? Ah, I see it was she. Well, I congratulate you." "Your congratulations are premature," was his reply. "Why? Isn't it settled yet?" She was able to speak calmly and coldly now, as though nothing had passed between them. "No, it's not settled," replied Ravenscroft. "Have I spoken too soon? I'm sorry. I was told you were engaged." "I'm not," he replied. But I want to be, Eleanor. Don't you understand?" "Understand what?" "There's only one girl in the world I can become engaged to, and her name is not Ongar. I want to be engaged to her. I mean to be too, if she'll have me. That's why I am so glad you have come home. Don't you understand?" Eleanor was silent. Something rose up within her which seemed to destroy all power of speech, but there was a glad look in her eyes. "I don't know who told you such a silly story," went on Ravenscroft. "I never thought of Miss Ongar in such a connection. How could I? There's only one girl in all the world for me, and her name is Eleanor Trelawney. Can't we begin again where we broke off, nearly a year ago?" I don't understand." "Oh, yes, you do. That's why I'm so glad, and more than glad, that you have come home. It's been a nightmare, hasn't it? I was horribly pained, but I couldn't help loving you all the same. I say, can't we begin again?" "But how can we when "Everything is possible now, Eleanor, if you love me," pleaded the young fellow. "Everything. If you had stayed away, nothing could have been possible. But now you've come home. I say, I know I'm a bungling fool. I was months ago, just before you left home. But I do love you, and I say, tell me I'm not mistaken. Tell me I haven't been thinking what can't be. For I want you, my dear. I want you. Heaven only knows how much." Her heart was throbbing wildly, throbbing with joy, such as she had never felt before. But that awful night," she began to stammer. Yes, I know all about that. That's nothing. You can tell me as much or as little as you please about that. I know that was only a part of the foolish business of your leaving home, but that never really troubled me. I always knew you were not that kind of girl." "Did you? You're sure?" "Of course I did." "Oh, I am ashamed," cried the girl. "I must have been mad. No, I'm not afraid to tell you everything about it. Thank heaven you were in time to see me back safely," she ended tamely. And you care for me, dear?" There was a tremor in his voice. She nodded her head. Yes, but that way. I want to hear you say so." "Yes," was her reply. "But oh, I shall never forgive myself, never." "For what?" "For my madness, for my disobedience to my father. It's made everything impossible." No," laughed Ravenscroft. "Nothing is impossible now." "But it is. No, I've done nothing wrong, and yet Somehow I feel my life has been sullied, as though I'm not worthy of anything beautiful and good." "But you love me? Tell me that again." "Yes, I love you." "Then you'll marry me?" "No, no, I can't. At least, not for a long time. I feel as though I am not worthy, as though I must atone." "Atone be hanged!" almost shouted Ravenscroft. There, there, I've got you now. All that mad business is over. It's all over. We're going to begin anew. You have come back home, and we are engaged, you see? No, it's no use your trying to get away. I've got you. We're engaged. You have promised to marry me, and it will have to be soon." "But I couldn't. I must keep my place at Spurling and King's." "Hang Spurling and King!" laughed Ravenscroft. "They will understand. I know Mr. Spurling well. He's a grand old chap, and when I tell him, he'll understand all about it. I could not tell you before, but I got you that place, Eleanor, and now I'm going to take you away from it. You are going to be my wife, do you see? I've told the General all about it, and Little by little Eleanor yielded to her heart's promptings, and as one explanation followed another, both the man and the girl entered into that joy which, although it may be the lot of all, is ever new, ever wonderful. "Yes," said the General late that same night, after Ravenscroft had gone back to his home and Trev had returned with Mary Penryn to Kensington. "It seems as though my heart is full, Alice. I never expected such joy to come to me." "It's very wonderful, isn't it?" said Mrs. Trelawney. "Oh, Lester, it seems as though the last few months have been a ghastly nightmare, and we have woken up to find it was only a dream." "In a way," assented the General. "In a way, yes. We have a great deal to be thankful for, and I trust I am thankful. Perhaps I needed all this to make me understand. Perhaps I, too, was forgetting the deep things of life. But it's wonderful. Fancy John turning out a genius, for I'm sure that invention of his will be a success. Bless the boy, I am proud of him. He has been a world of comfort to me, and to you too, Alice." "He has indeed. I don't know what I should have done without him during those dark days. And Trev, too. Trev has become wonderfully changed, hasn't he? What a good girl will do for a young fellow. And he seems so happy, too." "Who wouldn't be with such a girl as he's got?" laughed the General. "Were you surprised," said Mrs. Trelawney, "about Eleanor and Ravenscroft?" "Surprised? Not a bit. I knew it all along. Oh, at one time I was terribly afraid. It's come out all right, though. He told me about it tonight. Eleanor insists that she'll go to Spurling and King's for the remainder of the week, but he tells me he has persuaded her to give notice at once. I'm perfectly happy about her now. I had a long talk with them both. I had no idea she was really so affectionate." "Oh, God has been very good to us. If only little Peggy were, and Mrs. Trelawney's words ended in a sob. "Yes, yes, I know," said the General sadly. "Nothing can undo the past as far as Peggy is concerned, and it's a terrible business. Her life will be frightfully saddened, no matter what we may do. I cannot save her from the results of her madness. But Peggy's really a better girl now, and in a way is much happier than she was before." "Yes, I believe she is," assented the mother. "But, oh, my dear, it's awful to think about. She's only 19, and can't we do something, Lester?" "Of course I've learnt all about him. There will be no difficulty whatever in getting a divorce. The fellow is not only a bounder and a poisonous creature, but he has openly admitted to me to-day before witnesses that he has given Peggy the right to demand her complete freedom from him. Indeed, he wants it, and boasted to me that within 3 days of his freedom he would marry the woman for whom he gave up Peggy. Just think of it! I had difficulty in restraining myself, difficulty to keep my hands from him. But there, we'll get rid of him with as little publicity as possible, and then Peggy will be free. Perhaps, who knows, there may be a happy future for her after all." "I pray God there may be," sobbed his wife. "Oh, yes," and the General spoke cheerfully, "and please God there shall be, if love can make it so. My little Peg shall be happy, and thank God for it, Alice. None of the children were ever so near to us as they are now. Never did they love us so much." "No," replied Mrs. Trelawney, "and knowing that, I am happy in spite of everything." End of chapter 33. End of Prodigal Daughters, by Joseph Hocking.